Hey guys, tonight we step back into a world where the simple act of keeping a baby alive through July felt like negotiating with death itself. You're lying in a narrow bed, the pre-dawn darkness offering the last few moments of tolerable temperature before another brutal summer day begins in 1850s America. Somewhere nearby, your infant stirs in a wooden cradle, and you feel that familiar knot of anxiety tighten in your chest. There's no air conditioning humming in the corner, no refrigerator preserving safe milk, no pediatrician to call when the fever spikes. Just you, your wits, and a collection of folk remedies that may or may not work. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a week in this world without losing your mind from sheer terror and sweat-soaked exhaustion. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing that someone in Tokyo and someone in Toronto might be drifting off to the same strange historical tale. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The floorboards creak beneath your bare feet as you rise, and already you can feel the oppressive warmth that seeped into the walls overnight, refusing to leave. You live in a modest frame house somewhere in the mid-Atlantic states, let's say Pennsylvania, though this story could unfold in Ohio, Virginia, or anywhere east of the Mississippi where summer arrives like an unwelcome relative who overstays and eats all your food. Your baby is 3 months old, born in the hopeful coolness of April, and now you're entering what neighbours grimly call the dying season. You pause at the window, pushing aside the thin cotton curtain to check the sky. Already pale blue and cloudless. Another scorcher. You've heard the older women in town whisper about summers past when 3 or 4 babies died on the same block within a single week. They speak of it matter-of-factly, the way you might discuss a difficult harvest or a horse gone lame. Death in infancy isn't a tragedy that shocks the community into silence. It's a statistical likelihood that every mother carries in her heart like a stone. The thermometer nailed beside your back door, a relatively new invention that's becoming fashionable among the educated classes, reads 78 degrees at 5 in the morning. By noon, it will climb past 95 and the air will hang so thick and still that breathing feels like drinking warm soup. Your house has no cross-ventilation to speak of. The architect, if you can call the local carpenter that, designed it for keeping winter cold out, not summer heat. The walls are solid, the windows small, and the rooms trap warmth like ovens. You lift your baby from the cradle, feeling the damp heat radiating from that tiny body. Infants run hot anyway, their metabolisms burn bright and fast. But in summer, this natural warmth becomes dangerous. You've already stripped the cradle of its wool blanket, leaving only a thin linen sheet, but still the baby's skin feels clammy against your forearm. The little face scrunches, preparing for the morning cry that demands breakfast, and you settle into the rocking chair to nurse. Here's something that might surprise you. If you can breastfeed successfully, you've already given your baby the single greatest survival advantage available in 19th century America. Breast milk doesn't spoil, it doesn't carry the bacteria breeding in warm cow's milk left sitting in unrefrigerated containers. It provides hydration and nutrition in a perfectly balanced package that your baby's immature digestive system can actually handle. Historians estimate that breastfed infants died at roughly half the rate of those fed artificial substitutes during summer months. Half. That's not a marginal improvement. That's the difference between probably surviving and probably not. But breastfeeding isn't guaranteed. You might not produce enough milk. Stress, poor nutrition, and the physical demands of running a household without modern conveniences all conspire against adequate supply. You might develop mastitis, a painful breast infection that makes nursing agony. You might be one of the many women who simply cannot get the baby to latch properly, a problem that modern lactation consultants solve daily, but that in your era leads to cracked, bleeding nipples and a starving, screaming infant. Or you might be dead already, having succumbed to childbed fever or hemorrhage, leaving your baby motherless and dependent on whatever substitute feeding your grieving husband can arrange. The morning stretches on, and you move through the rituals of infant care that will consume most of your waking hours. Changing the baby's diaper, which is actually a cloth napkin, or clout, that you'll wash by hand in a basin of water you hauled from the well or pump, requires constant repetition. Babies in hot weather need changing more frequently, because the combination of waste and heat creates the perfect environment for diaper rash, which can progress to open sores, which can become infected, which can kill. You don't have diaper cream or zinc oxide paste. You have lard, maybe, or goose grease. or simply the hope that keeping the area clean and dry will be enough. The house grows warmer by the hour. You open every window, but outside the air sits motionless, heavy with humidity. Flies buzz through the openings you've created, landing on everything. The baby's face, the food on your table, the chamber pot in the corner waiting to be emptied. Each fly potentially carries disease on its feet, though you don't know this in scientific terms. You just know that flies are a nuisance and a sign of uncleanliness, so you wave them away constantly, a never-ending battle that exhausts your arms and your patience. Your neighbour stops by around mid-morning, a woman perhaps 10 years older, who has buried 2 of her 6 children, both during summer months. She peers at your baby with an appraising eye that makes you uncomfortable, as if she's calculating odds. She offers advice: keep the baby quiet, don't overstimulate, avoid taking the child outside during the hottest hours. Also, she adds, have you tried hanging wet sheets in the doorways? The evaporation cools the air somewhat. She learned this from her grandmother, who learned it from hers, a chain of survival knowledge passed from woman to woman across generations. You thank her, genuinely grateful, though you've already tried the wet sheets and found they help only marginally. What you really need is to escape to the countryside, to the cooler elevations where wealthy families retreat each summer. But you're not wealthy. Your husband works as a clerk or a tradesman, earning just enough to keep you in this house with food on the table. There's no summer cottage waiting in the mountains, no relatives with a farm where breezes blow across open fields. You're stuck here, in this hot box of a house, praying your baby is strong enough to endure. The afternoon brings the worst heat. You retreat to the cellar with the baby, descending the narrow stairs into the cool, damp darkness below ground level. The temperature down here hovers around 65 degrees even on the hottest days, nature's primitive air conditioning. Many families with cellars use them as summer refuges, spreading blankets on the dirt floor and spending the brutal afternoon hours in this underground sanctuary. The problem is that cellars are also damp, potentially mouldy, and often home to insects and rodents. Historians still argue whether the benefits of cellar cooling outweighed the risks of the respiratory problems and other ailments that damp conditions might cause. You make your choice based on instinct. The heat above seems more immediately dangerous than the dampness below. The baby sleeps in your arms as you sit on an overturned crate, listening to the muffled sounds of the world above. A dog barks somewhere. A cart rattles past on the unpaved street. Your own breathing sounds loud in the enclosed space. You think about your mother, who raised 7 children to adulthood, an almost miraculous achievement, and wonder what secrets she knew that you haven't yet learned. You think about the tiny grave in the churchyard, the one belonging to your first baby, who didn't survive the winter croup 2 years ago. You think about how strange it is that humans keep having children when the odds of heartbreak seem so high. Evening finally arrives, bringing temperatures that drop back into the 80s, still uncomfortable, but survivable. You emerge from the cellar, blinking in the slanted golden light, and begin preparing the simple supper your husband will expect when he returns from work. The baby rides on your hip, because setting an infant down in a 19th-century kitchen means risking burns from the cook stove, cuts from sharp implements left within reach, or simply the terror of a baby rolling off whatever surface you've placed them on. Baby containers, bouncy seats, swings, playpens don't exist in their modern forms. You have the cradle, your arms, and maybe a simple wooden high chair for older babies who can sit up. The night brings its own challenges. You'll learn more about those in the hours to come. For now, you simply exist in this moment. A mother, a baby, a brutal summer day survived. 1 down, perhaps 90 more to go before September brings relief. The mathematics of survival are exhausting to contemplate, so you don't. You just keep moving, keep nursing, keep wiping sweat from your baby's brow, keep praying to whatever power you believe in that this child will be one of the lucky ones. Outside your window, the last light fades from the sky, and somewhere across town a church bell tolls. You count the rings automatically, 7 o'clock, and settle into the rocking chair for another nursing session. Tomorrow will bring more heat, more fear, more exhausting vigilance. But tonight, right now, your baby is alive and breathing and looking up at you with those unfocused newborn eyes that seem to see something beyond the visible world. That's enough. For tonight, that's enough. The numbers tell a story so grim that modern parents might struggle to comprehend it. You're living through an era when roughly 1 in 4 babies born in American cities won't survive to see their first birthday, and summer pushes that fraction even higher in the worst neighborhoods. In some tenement districts of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, infant mortality during July and August doubles or even triples compared to winter months. You don't have access to these statistics in neat charts and graphs. That kind of public health data collection is still in its infancy, ironically enough. But you feel the truth of it in the empty cradles, the small coffins carried through streets, the mothers who can't meet your eyes because they've just buried another child. The summer of 1850 killed an estimated 10,000 infants in New York City alone. Let that number settle into your consciousness as you rock your baby in the stifling heat. 10,000 in one city in one summer. That's roughly equivalent to every baby born in the city that year, though of course deaths weren't distributed evenly. Wealthy families in airy homes with access to country retreats and clean milk lost babies too, but at far lower rates. The dying concentrated among the poor, the immigrant, the crowded, the desperate. If you live in a tenement with one window and a shared privy for 20 families, your baby's chances plummet. If you live in a brownstone with cross-ventilation and a servant to fetch fresh milk daily, your baby might just make it. You become hyper-aware of every symptom, every change in your baby's condition. A slight fever sends you into quiet panic. Loose stools, which are normal for breastfed infants, make you examine the diaper's contents with the intensity of a scientist studying specimens. You've heard about cholera infantum, the dreaded summer complaint that kills with brutal efficiency, and you know the progression. The baby becomes listless, refuses to nurse, develops watery diarrhea that quickly turns greenish, then the vomiting begins, and within days, or sometimes hours, dehydration claims another small life. The speed of it terrifies you most. A baby can seem fine at breakfast and be dead by supper. Your grandmother, if she's still alive, might tell you that this is simply the way of things. God gives and God takes away. The phrase infant mortality doesn't carry the same emotional weight it does in the 21st century because infant death isn't a medical failure or a preventable tragedy in the collective consciousness. It's a fact of existence, like winter cold or summer heat. Parents name babies after older siblings who died, recycling the names as if the new child might somehow continue the interrupted life of the one who came before. Gravestones in churchyards list multiple children from the same family, their death dates clustered in July and August with eerie regularity. But you can't accept this fatalism. Not really. Not when you look at your baby's face and see a person, a future, a possibility. So you do everything within your limited power to shift the odds. You keep the nursery as clean as possible, scrubbing floors and surfaces with lye soap and water. You boil the rags you use for diapers, even though the extra heat from the fire makes the house even more unbearable. You watch other mothers, noting whose babies thrive and who sicken, trying to reverse engineer the secrets of success. Maybe Mrs. Hennessy's baby survived last summer because she never took him outside during midday. Maybe the German woman on the corner has some old country wisdom worth learning. The medical establishment offers little comfort. Doctors in this era are still operating largely on theories inherited from ancient Greece, particularly the notion that disease results from imbalances in bodily humours. Summer heat, they believe, causes an excess of bile, which explains why babies develop digestive troubles. Treatment focuses on restoring balance through purging, sweating, and bleeding, approaches that might actually hasten death rather than prevent it. A doctor called to attend a sick infant might prescribe calomel, a mercury-based compound that induces violent diarrhea and vomiting. The logic, such as it is, holds that expelling the excess bile will restore health. In reality, you're poisoning a baby who's already desperately dehydrated. Historians still argue whether having access to a physician improved or worsened an infant's survival odds during this period. Some evidence suggests that babies treated entirely at home by their mothers, using common-sense nursing care and folk remedies, fared better than those subjected to aggressive medical intervention. This isn't to say that 19th century mothers knew better than doctors, it's to say that the doctors often knew so little that their interventions caused net harm. The humility to admit ignorance and simply support the body's natural healing processes might have saved more lives than all the calomel in the apothecary's cabinet. You learn to recognise the warning signs that separate ordinary summer discomfort from genuine crisis. A baby who nurses eagerly, wets diapers regularly, and remains alert between naps is probably fine, even if sweaty and fussy. A baby who refuses the breast, produces scanty dark urine, and lies limp and unresponsive has entered dangerous territory. The fontanelle, that soft spot on the top of the skull where the bones haven't yet fused, becomes a diagnostic tool. When it sinks inward, visible as a depression rather than a gentle curve, the baby is seriously dehydrated. You check it obsessively, pressing your fingers against your own baby's head multiple times a day, reassuring yourself that the fontanelle remains normal. The emotional toll of this constant vigilance is something historians sometimes overlook when they focus on mortality statistics and medical practices. You're essentially maintaining a months-long state of low-grade anxiety that would exhaust anyone. Sleep deprivation compounds the stress, babies need to nurse frequently, and summer heat makes everyone sleep poorly anyway. Your husband, even if sympathetic, goes off to work each day and returns to find you haggard, irritable and focused entirely on the baby's welfare to the exclusion of household duties he might expect you to maintain. Marriages strain under this pressure. Some women develop what we would now recognise as postpartum depression or anxiety, conditions that had no name and no treatment in this era, except perhaps a prescription for rest that no mother of an infant can actually follow. And yet life continues around you. The neighbours gossip, the church holds services, the market sells vegetables and meat, and the contaminated milk you're learning to distrust. You attend a funeral for a baby who lived 3 houses down, standing in the sweltering churchyard as the minister speaks words about innocence and heaven that are meant to comfort but somehow don't. The mother's face is blank, emptied by grief beyond tears. You've seen that expression before and you pray you'll never wear it yourself. Summer follows a pattern that becomes grimly familiar. The early weeks of June bring pleasant warmth that feels almost hopeful. Then July arrives with temperatures that push past 90 and stay there, day after day, and the dying accelerates. August continues the assault, often adding drought that shrinks wells and makes clean water even harder to obtain. September finally breaks the fever, both literally and metaphorically, and the survivors emerge blinking into cooler air, marvelling that they've made it through another year. October brings the harvest and a strange amnesia, as if the summer's horrors were a bad dream already fading. Then winter presents its own challenges: croup, pneumonia, scarlet fever, and by the time spring returns you've almost forgotten how terrifying summer can be. Almost. The wealthy have options you can only dream about. They pack up entire households and relocate to Newport, Saratoga, or the Adirondacks, spending the dangerous months in airy resort hotels or family estates where temperatures rarely climb above the mid-80s, and breezes blow off lakes and through forest glens. Their babies still face risks, of course. Disease plays no favourites, absolutely. But the combination of cooler air, cleaner water, and better nutrition tips the scales dramatically in their favour. You read about their summer adventures in the newspaper, the society pages describing elegant parties and lawn tennis matches, and you try not to feel bitter. Bitterness is a luxury you can't afford. It takes energy away from the essential work of keeping your baby alive. The church offers spiritual comfort if you're inclined to receive it. Ministers preach about God's inscrutable will, about the souls of dead infants ascending immediately to heaven, about the importance of submission and trust in the face of suffering. Some women find genuine peace in these messages. Others mouth the prayers while privately raging against a deity who would design a world where babies die of heat and contaminated milk. The question of theodicy, why a good God permits suffering, becomes intensely personal when you're calculating whether your baby will survive the week. A quirky detail that might surprise you: some families in this era practice a ritual called measuring the baby against a specific threshold or object to assess growth and health. If the baby has grown past a certain mark on the doorframe or weighs more than a particular bag of flour, superstition holds that the child has passed a survival milestone. These practices blend Christian faith with older folk traditions, creating a syncretic approach to infant welfare that the educated classes might dismiss as ignorance, but that provides real psychological comfort to anxious parents. The evening cools slightly, and you take the baby outside for the first time since morning. The street is coming alive with families escaping their suffocating homes, sitting on stoops and porches, fanning themselves and chatting with neighbours. Children play in the dirt, their laughter carrying on the still air. You join a cluster of other mothers, exchanging news and advice, and for a moment the anxiety loosens its grip. Community matters. Shared experience matters. You're not alone in this fight, even if each family must ultimately face the summer alone in their own particular circumstances. Tomorrow the heat will return. The statistics will continue their grim accumulation. But tonight, In this brief window of relative comfort, you allow yourself to hope. The air itself seems dangerous in ways that would make you laugh if you weren't so genuinely frightened. You live in an era that believes disease travels on invisible vapours, miasmas, that rise from swamps, refuse heaps, and any place where organic matter decomposes in heat. The theory isn't entirely wrong, of course. Places that smell bad often are unhealthy, not because of the smell itself, but because the same conditions that produce odour also breed mosquitoes, bacteria, and other actual disease vectors. But without germ theory, which won't gain widespread acceptance until decades from now, you and everyone around you focus on the wrong enemy. You're fighting smells when you should be fighting microbes. Your morning routine includes a careful assessment of the air quality. You sniff at the breeze coming through the window, trying to detect any hint of foulness that might herald disease. The neighbours have been complaining about the stench from the slaughterhouse 2 blocks over, where animal waste accumulates faster than it can be carted away. Some families have hung sachets of herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint, near their windows, believing the pleasant scents will counteract dangerous miasmas. You've done the same, more out of desperation than conviction, and the baby's room carries a faint perfume of dried flowers that reminds you of your grandmother's parlour. Ventilation becomes an obsession, but a contradictory one. Fresh air is supposed to dispel miasmas, so you want windows open. But fresh air in summer is often hot air, and heat itself seems to carry sickness, so maybe windows should be closed during the worst afternoon hours. And what about night air, which some authorities consider particularly dangerous, full of invisible poisons that rise from the earth after dark? The medical advice you receive is hopelessly muddled. Dr. Thompson down the street recommends keeping the nursery sealed and darkened during the day, while the pamphlet you picked up at the apothecary insists on constant ventilation, regardless of temperature. You split the difference, opening windows in the morning and evening while closing them during midday, and hope you've guessed correctly. The debate extends to the baby's immediate sleeping environment. Should the cradle sit near the window where breezes might reach it, risking exposure to whatever miasmas lurk outside? Or should it occupy the centre of the room, away from drafts, at the cost of stagnant air that grows uncomfortably warm? Historians still argue whether the ventilation practices of this era had measurable effects on infant survival, or whether parents were essentially manipulating variables that didn't matter while ignoring the ones that did. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Better air circulation did help keep babies cooler, which reduced heat-related stress, but the obsession with miasmas distracted from more effective interventions like improved sanitation and clean water. You develop a sixth sense for air movement, noticing the faintest stirring of a curtain that might indicate a breeze. On the rare days when wind actually blows, you position the baby to catch it, angling the cradle toward the open window like a sailor adjusting sails. On the more common still days, you create artificial breezes by fanning, an exhausting, repetitive motion that nonetheless seems to provide real relief. Wealthy families have servants to handle the fanning, or they own mechanical devices imported from Asia that create airflow through hand-cranked or foot-pedalled mechanisms. You have your own 2 hands and a woven palm fan purchased for a few cents at the market. The baby's nursery develops its own microclimate that you learn to read like a farmer reading weather. The northeast corner stays coolest because it receives no direct sunlight. The area near the cook stove in the adjoining room radiates heat that penetrates the wall. The spot directly beneath the window can shift from comfortable to unbearably hot depending on the sun's angle. You move the cradle throughout the day, chasing comfort like a nomad following water sources, and by late summer you've memorised the temperature patterns so thoroughly that you can predict down to the quarter hour when each spot will become intolerable. Some families go to extremes that seem either brilliant or insane depending on your perspective. The Hoffmans 3 streets over have reportedly dug a tunnel from their cellar to their garden, creating an underground passage where air circulates more freely than in the house above. The project took weeks and nearly bankrupted them, but they swear their children have been healthier since its completion. Another family constructed a sleeping porch on their roof, believing that elevation brings cooler air and fewer miasmas, and they haul their babies up a ladder each night to sleep under the stars. These improvised solutions demonstrate the desperation that summer induces, people willing to try anything, no matter how laborious or eccentric, if it might improve their children's odds. The language of miasma pervades daily conversation in ways that would sound absurd to modern ears. The air is heavy today, a neighbour remarks. meaning not humidity in the meteorological sense, but a perceived density of dangerous vapours. That wind comes from the marsh, another warns, suggesting that breezes from certain directions carry more sickness than others. Parents scrutinise weather patterns, not for precipitation or temperature alone, but for the complex interplay of factors they believe determine air quality. A summer thunderstorm might be welcome not just for the cooling rain, but for the lightning, which some believe purifies the atmosphere of its poisonous elements. You've heard of physicians who recommend fumigation, burning sulphur or other strong-smelling substances inside the home to drive out miasmas. The practice has ancient roots and will persist well into the 20th century, even as germ theory gradually replaces miasma theory in medical education. You tried it once, early in the summer, lighting a small dish of sulphur in the corner of the nursery and coughing through the acrid smoke while the baby wailed in protest. The experience was miserable enough that you haven't repeated it, though the fear lingers that you're neglecting a potentially life-saving intervention out of mere discomfort. The miasma theory does lead to some genuinely helpful behaviours, even if for the wrong reasons. The belief that refuse and waste generate dangerous vapours motivates you to keep your home cleaner than you otherwise might, removing garbage promptly and scrubbing surfaces regularly. The conviction that stagnant water breeds miasmas leads you to empty any containers where water collects, inadvertently eliminating mosquito breeding sites. Public health reformers who advocate for cleaner streets, better sewage systems, and the removal of nuisances like slaughterhouses from residential areas base their arguments on miasma theory, and the improvements they achieve will reduce disease even though their underlying reasoning is flawed. A quirky belief specific to this era holds that certain colours of paint or wallpaper affect air quality in the nursery. Green, particularly a popular shade called Paris green, is thought by some to promote healthy air, while dark colours like crimson are suspected of harbouring miasmas in their very pigment. What nobody realises, at least not yet, is that Paris green contains arsenic, and children in rooms painted with it sometimes develop mysterious illnesses as the pigment slowly releases toxic fumes in warm, humid conditions. The irony would be darkly comic if it weren't so tragic. Parents carefully selecting a colour believed to protect their babies from miasmas are actually poisoning them with heavy metals. You make your choices based on the information available, which is to say based on a mixture of traditional wisdom, medical advice, neighbourhood gossip, and your own observations. The nursery stays relatively clean. The windows open and close according to a schedule you've devised through trial and error. The baby receives whatever breezes you can capture or create, and you try not to breathe too deeply when the wind shifts from the direction of the tannery, because even if miasma theory is wrong about mechanisms, your nose isn't wrong about the fact that certain smells correlate with certain illnesses in ways nobody fully understands. The evening brings a phenomenon you've come to anticipate with relief: the country air that descends as temperature gradients reverse, and cooler air from surrounding farmland flows into the city. It's not imaginary. Urban heat islands were real in the 19th century just as they are today, and you can actually feel the quality of the air change around sunset, becoming fresher and easier to breathe. You station yourself by the window with the baby, catching this precious influx of better air, storing it up like provisions against the night ahead. Sleep comes with its own atmospheric anxieties. The bedroom feels like a sealed box as darkness falls, and you debate whether to leave the window open despite concerns about night air. Your husband prefers it closed, citing some article he read about the dangers of sleeping in drafts. You prefer it open, willing to risk mysterious night vapours in exchange for any relief from the suffocating heat. The compromise involves a complicated arrangement of curtains and bedclothes that satisfies neither of you, but at least prevents an argument. In the cradle beside your bed, the baby breathes steadily, small chest rising and falling in a rhythm you've come to know as intimately as your own heartbeat. Whatever miasmas or vapours surround this small sleeping form, whatever invisible dangers lurk in the summer air, you can do nothing more tonight. You've fought the atmosphere with every weapon available, and now you simply wait for dawn. The problem begins the moment breast milk proves insufficient or unavailable. You've been nursing successfully for 3 months, but suddenly your supply seems to be dwindling. The baby fusses at the breast, pulls away unsatisfied, cries with hunger even after feeding. You try nursing more frequently, drinking more water, eating heartier meals, but nothing seems to restore the abundant flow you enjoyed in the cooler spring. Summer heat, stress, fatigue, and perhaps some underlying condition you'll never have a name for have conspired against your mammary glands, and now you face the terrifying prospect of finding an alternative food source for your infant. The options before you range from inadequate to actively dangerous. Cow's milk is the most common substitute, but cow's milk in 19th-century America bears little resemblance to the pasteurized, refrigerated product you'd find in a modern grocery store. It comes from cows whose health is uncertain, milked under conditions that would horrify a modern sanitation inspector, transported in containers that may or may not have been cleaned since the last use, and sold hours or even days after collection without any cooling whatsoever. In summer, this milk has been sitting at bacteria-friendly temperatures for extended periods, culturing an invisible army of pathogens that will colonize your baby's immature digestive system with devastating efficiency. You visit the milkman who delivers to your neighborhood, a weathered man with a cart and 2 large metal containers that he fills from farms outside the city. He assures you his milk is fresh, but you've heard the same assurances from every dairy vendor, and you've also heard the stories about babies who died within days of switching to cow's milk. The milk itself looks fine, white, opaque, without obvious signs of spoilage, but you can't see the bacteria multiplying within it, and neither can he. He doesn't even know bacteria exist, not in any scientific sense. He just knows that milk goes sour faster in summer, and that customers complain more about stomach troubles when the weather turns hot. You bring the milk home in a covered pail, trying to keep it cool during the short walk from the delivery cart to your kitchen. Immediately you face the question of preparation. Raw milk straight from the cow? Some authorities recommend this as most natural and therefore most healthful. Boiled milk with the dangerous elements killed. Other authorities suggest this, though the boiling process changes the taste and texture in ways babies sometimes reject. Diluted with water. Many physicians advise cutting the milk with equal parts water to make it more digestible for infant systems, but this reduces the caloric content and, if the water itself is contaminated, adds a second source of potential infection. Historians still argue whether mothers who boiled their milk saw better outcomes than those who served it raw. The evidence is fragmentary and contradictory, partly because so many variables affected infant survival, and partly because the connection between boiling and bacterial death wasn't understood clearly enough to ensure consistent practice. A mother might boil her milk once, see no immediate improvement in her baby's condition, and abandon the practice as useless. Another might boil diligently but contaminate the milk afterward by pouring it into an unclean vessel, or letting it sit at room temperature for hours before feeding. The feeding apparatus itself presents challenges. Baby bottles exist in this era, but they're primitive devices compared to modern designs, often made of glass with narrow necks that are nearly impossible to clean thoroughly, fitted with rubber or leather nipples that harbour bacteria in every crevice and crack. The most common design includes a long tube connecting the nipple to the bottle's base, supposedly allowing the baby to suck from any angle, but actually creating a perfect breeding ground for contamination. These so-called murder bottles will later be blamed for countless infant deaths, but for now they're sold as modern conveniences, improvements over the older practice of feeding babies with spoons or pap boats. You opt for a simpler approach, a small ceramic vessel with a spout that you can dip the baby's mouth toward, avoiding the problematic bottles altogether. It's messier and slower than bottle feeding, but easier to clean and less likely to retain yesterday's milk residue. You feed your baby small amounts frequently throughout the day, trying to minimise the time any batch of milk spends at room temperature. Each feeding is an act of faith. You're placing your baby's life in the hands of cows you've never seen, milkmen you barely know, and preparation methods you've cobbled together from conflicting advice. The baby initially rejects the cow's milk, turning away from the unfamiliar taste and crying for the breast that can no longer fully satisfy. You persist, partly because you have no choice and partly because the baby will eventually eat when hungry enough. Within a day or two, acceptance comes, and your infant begins consuming the white liquid that might nourish or might kill. You watch for symptoms: loose stools, vomiting, lethargy, fever, the way a sailor watches for storm clouds, knowing that the first signs of trouble may precede catastrophe by only hours. The other mothers in your neighbourhood have their own strategies and opinions. Mrs. O'Brien swears by goat's milk, claiming it's closer to human milk in composition and easier for babies to digest. She may be partially right. Goat's milk does have smaller fat globules and slightly different proteins, But goats are harder to come by in the city, and goat's milk carries its own contamination risks. Mrs. Schmidt supplements cow's milk with thin gruel made from barley or oatmeal, creating a pap that provides additional calories and supposedly strengthens the infant's stomach. This practice has centuries of tradition behind it, but tends to introduce solid particles that immature digestive systems can't handle well. A more affluent family down the street has hired a wet nurse, a woman who recently lost her own baby and now sells her surplus milk to mothers who can afford the arrangement. This solution seems ideal, human milk from a human breast, without the contamination risks of animal milk or the technological challenges of bottles and nipples. But wet nursing comes with its own complexities, which you'll explore more deeply as this journey continues. For now, you simply note that this option is beyond your financial reach and return to your ceramic vessel and your careful preparations. The cost of cow's milk is itself a burden. Prices rise in summer when demand increases and supply sometimes falters. You calculate the daily expense of keeping your baby fed and realise it represents a significant portion of your household budget, money that might otherwise go toward rent, food for the rest of the family, or saving against future emergencies. The arithmetic of infant feeding is yet another stress piled atop the physical and emotional burdens you already carry. Some mothers, desperate and impoverished, resort to feeding their babies substances that would appall a modern parent. Sweetened water, tea, thin soups, bread soaked in milk or water until it forms a paste. Beer, which some believe strengthens babies and helps them sleep. Opium-laced soothing syrups that will quiet a hungry, crying infant, but provide no nutrition and risk overdose. The spectrum of infant feeding in 19th-century America ranges from the merely inadequate to the actively poisonous, and the line between categories isn't always clear to parents operating with limited information and resources. You do the best you can with what you have. Each morning you collect the fresh milk, examine it for signs of spoilage, heat it carefully over the stove, dilute it according to the latest advice you've received, and offer it to your baby in small, frequent doses. Each evening you scrub the feeding vessels with soap and hot water, trying to remove every trace of residue that might sour and contaminate tomorrow's supply. Each night you pray that you've done enough, that the invisible forces working against your baby's survival will relent for another day. The milk problem is, in many ways, the central challenge of infant survival in 19th-century summers. Breastfeeding protects, but isn't always possible. Artificial feeding is necessary but dangerous. The gap between need and safe supply claims thousands of lives each year, and until pasteurization, refrigeration, and modern formula close that gap, mothers like you will navigate this minefield with insufficient maps and too many explosives hidden beneath the surface. Your baby finishes the evening feeding and drifts into sleep, apparently satisfied for now. You study the small face for any sign of distress, any hint that something is wrong, and find only peaceful slumber. Tomorrow you'll do it all again. Tonight, you rest in the fragile comfort of survival. The woman who answers your inquiry is young, perhaps 22, with a tired face and a dress that has seen better days. She lives in the poorer section of town, in a boarding house where the smell of cabbage and lye soap permeates the hallways. Her name is Margaret, and 3 weeks ago she gave birth to a baby boy who lived only 6 days before succumbing to some unnamed summer ailment. Her breasts, still full of milk that her dead child will never drink, have become both a source of grief and a potential income. She has placed an advertisement in the newspaper. Healthy wet nurse seeks situation. Inquire at 14 Oak Street. You've come because your milk supply has failed entirely and the cow's milk you've been using has given your baby persistent diarrhea that refuses to clear. The choice before you is stark. Continue with artificial feeding and watch your infant weaken further, or hire this stranger to nourish your child with her body. Your husband has agreed to the expense, barely, and now you sit in Margaret's small rented room, conducting an interview that would have been unthinkable in your grandmother's era, but has become almost routine in yours. The wet nurse trade occupies a peculiar position in 19th-century American society. In earlier centuries, wet nursing was common among wealthy European families who considered breastfeeding too animalistic for refined women. In America, attitudes have shifted somewhat. Medical authorities now generally recommend maternal nursing as healthiest, but the demand for wet nurses persists because so many women cannot or will not nurse their own babies. The supply comes from women like Margaret, working class or poor, often unmarried or widowed or abandoned, with milk to sell because their own babies have died or been sent away to foundling homes. You assess Margaret with an evaluating eye that she accepts with resignation. Is she healthy? Her complexion seems clear, her breathing normal, her eyes bright enough. Is she moral? The question seems absurd given your desperation, but the medical literature warns that a wet nurse's character can somehow affect her milk, transmitting vice along with nutrients. Is her milk abundant? She demonstrates by expressing a stream into a dish, proving her capacity. The milk looks white and creamy, more opulent than the watered-down cow's milk you've been struggling with. The negotiation is brief and businesslike. Margaret will come to your home twice daily to nurse your baby, supplementing whatever artificial feeding you continue between her visits. In exchange, you'll pay her a weekly wage that exceeds what she could earn as a laundress or domestic servant. Wet nursing is one of the few occupations where female bodies command premium prices. She'll take her meals in your kitchen and rest on a cot in the cellar between sessions, essentially becoming a temporary member of your household whose primary function is producing milk. Some families take a different approach. Instead of bringing the wet nurse to the baby, they send the baby to the wet nurse. Putting out to nurse remains common in this era, particularly among families who need the mother to return to work quickly, or who prefer not to house a stranger under their roof. A baby sent to live with a wet nurse in the countryside might benefit from cleaner air and water, but loses the constant supervision of its own parents, and becomes dependent on the care of someone who may or may not prioritise its welfare over her own interests. Horror stories circulate about babies neglected, starved, or deliberately harmed by wet nurses more interested in the monthly payment than the child's survival. You've decided that keeping your baby home, even with the disadvantages of city life, is preferable to this particular gamble. Margaret arrives the next morning at 7, while the air is still relatively cool. You hand over your baby with a mixture of relief and unease, watching as this stranger unbuttons her bodice and guides your child to her breast. The baby latches with an eagerness that makes you simultaneously grateful and jealous. Your own milk couldn't satisfy that hunger, but Margaret's apparently can. You busy yourself with household tasks while trying not to stare, acutely aware of the intimacy unfolding in your parlour between your child and another woman. The relationship between mother and wet nurse is complex in ways that few historical accounts fully capture. You depend on Margaret for your baby's survival, which gives her a power over you that servants rarely possess. She, in turn, depends on you for income and lodging, which makes her vulnerable to your demands and whims. The baby occupies the space between you, innocent of the social dynamics but entirely subject to them. If Margaret falls ill, your baby suffers. If you fail to pay her wages, she might leave. If the arrangement sours for any reason, everyone loses. Historians still argue whether wet nursing improved or harmed infant survival rates overall. On one hand, human milk from a healthy wet nurse is nutritionally superior to any artificial substitute available in this era. On the other hand, the wet nurse trade created conditions that sometimes endangered babies. The wet nurse's own children might be deprived of milk and die. The transfer of infection between households was possible. The incentives for wet nurses to take on more clients than they could adequately serve led to diluted attention and care. The system was better than nothing, but worse than a world where all mothers could successfully nurse their own babies. The racial and class dimensions of wet nursing deserve mention, though you might not consciously reflect on them in these terms. In the antebellum South, enslaved black women were commonly forced to serve as wet nurses for their owners' children, sometimes at the expense of their own infants. In northern cities, Irish and German immigrant women dominated the wet nurse trade, their bodies becoming commodities in an economy that offered them few other options for earning a living wage. The woman nursing your baby carries her own griefs and struggles that you glimpse only dimly, if at all. Her dead child, her financial precarity, her social position, these form the hidden foundation of the arrangement that keeps your baby alive. Margaret proves to be competent and reliable over the following weeks. Your baby gains weight, the diarrhea resolves, the frightening listlessness gives way to the normal alertness of a thriving infant. You begin to hope, cautiously, that you found a solution to the feeding crisis. The expense strains your budget but seems worth it when you see your baby actually flourishing for the first time since summer began. A quirky aspect of the wet nurse economy. Some families request that wet nurses follow specific diets believed to improve milk quality. No onions, garlic or strong spices, plenty of beer or ale, thought to promote abundant milk production. Fresh vegetables if available. No heating foods that might make the milk too warm for tender infant stomachs. Margaret follows your dietary instructions without complaint, eating what you provide and avoiding what you forbid, though you sometimes wonder if she cheats when away from your supervision. The moral dimension never entirely fades. Your minister has preached about the unnaturalness of separating infants from mothers, suggesting that God designed women to nurse their own children, and that interference with this design invites divine displeasure. But your minister hasn't watched a baby waste away from malnutrition, hasn't calculated the odds of survival with and without human milk, hasn't made the desperate choices that summer forces upon mothers like you. You push the theological qualms aside and focus on the practical result. Your baby is alive and growing. Margaret stays through July and into August. Her milk holds out, your baby continues to thrive, and gradually the worst of the summer passes. When September arrives with its cooler days and longer nights, you realise that you've made it through the dangerous season with your child intact. Margaret's role diminishes as you gradually introduce solid foods and reduce the reliance on milk of any kind. Eventually she'll move on to another family, another baby, another temporary intimacy with strangers who need what her body can provide. You'll never quite know how to feel about the arrangement. Gratitude, certainly. Your baby would probably have died without Margaret's milk, but also discomfort, guilt, an awareness that your child's survival came at a cost, financial, social, emotional, that you're still processing. The wet nurse trade is one of those historical phenomena that reveals how desperate circumstances create complex dependencies between people who might otherwise never interact, binding them together in relationships that defy easy categorization. For now, in this moment, you simply hold your healthy baby and whisper a prayer of thanks to whatever forces, divine, biological, economic, conspired to keep this small life burning through another brutal summer. The milk that kills babies doesn't look like poison. It looks like milk, white, opaque, vaguely wholesome. And that's exactly the problem. You're holding a cup of the stuff right now, purchased from a vendor whose cart you've seen on this corner for years, and you have no way of knowing that this particular liquid came from a cow that hasn't seen grass or sunlight in months, a cow fed exclusively on the hot steaming waste from a brewery, a cow so sick with tuberculosis that her udders are covered in sores, a cow whose milk has been doctored with chalk to cover its bluish tint and molasses to disguise its sour taste. Welcome to the swill milk trade, one of the most horrifying public health scandals of 19th-century urban America. The system works like this. Breweries and distilleries produce enormous quantities of waste called swill or slop, the leftover grain mash after alcohol has been extracted. This waste is hot, wet, and would cost money to dispose of properly. Instead, clever entrepreneurs realised they could feed it to dairy cows, setting up massive cattle operations directly adjacent to distilleries where cows stand in cramped, filthy stalls, eating nothing but this nutritionally deficient, often contaminated byproduct. The cows sicken, develop lesions and infections, produce thin, bluish milk with an off taste, and this milk gets sold to urban consumers who have no idea where it comes from. The adulteration is systematic and shameless. Swill milk is so obviously inferior that vendors doctor it to pass as acceptable product. Chalk or plaster of Paris whitens the telltale blue colour. Molasses or sugar masks the sour flavour. Water stretches the supply, increasing profits at the expense of nutritional value. Sometimes starch or flour thickens watered-down milk to the expected consistency. The milk that reaches your kitchen has been processed, altered and disguised to the point where it barely qualifies as food, and you're feeding it to your baby because you have no other option and no way to know the truth. The death toll is staggering. Reformers will later estimate that swill milk kills between 8,000 and 10,000 infants annually in New York City alone during the peak years of the trade. That number may be exaggerated for rhetorical effect, but even conservative estimates suggest thousands of babies die each year from contaminated milk in major American cities. The connection between swill dairies and infant mortality is so direct that neighbourhoods near large distilleries show measurably higher death rates than those farther away. A correlation that public health investigators will eventually document and publicise. You might be wondering why nobody stops this. The answer involves politics, economics, and the limited regulatory capacity of mid-19th century American government. Distillery owners have money and influence. Dairy vendors have customers who need affordable milk and can't pay premium prices for country products. Public health inspections are sporadic and easily corrupted. A small bribe ensures the inspector sees only what the vendor wants him to see. Newspapers occasionally run exposés, but outrage fades quickly and the trade continues essentially unchanged until reformers finally build enough political momentum to force action. The most famous exposé comes in 1858, when journalist Frank Leslie publishes a series of illustrated articles in his newspaper, documenting the swill milk trade in horrifying detail. His reporters infiltrate distillery dairies, sketch the diseased cows and filthy conditions, analyse the adulterated product, and present their findings to a shocked public. The reaction is intense but temporary. Politicians promise investigations, a few of the worst operators are prosecuted, and then attention moves on to other scandals and the swill milk continues to flow. Your personal experience with this system depends on where you live and how much you can afford to spend on milk. The worst swill milk concentrates in poor neighbourhoods, where price matters more than quality, and where families lack the connections to obtain better alternatives. Wealthier families can sometimes arrange direct deliveries from country farms, paying premium prices for milk that comes from grass-fed cows raised in clean conditions. The class gradient of infant mortality maps almost perfectly onto the class gradient of milk access. One more way that poverty kills children in 19th-century America. Historians still argue about the relative contributions of different factors to infant mortality. Was contaminated milk the primary killer? Or did water contamination, heat stress, poor sanitation, and other variables play equally important roles? The evidence suggests that milk was likely the single most dangerous element of infant feeding in this era, particularly in urban areas during summer months when bacterial growth accelerated rapidly. A baby-fed clean breast milk might survive conditions that would kill a baby-fed swill milk within days. You learn over time to navigate this minefield as best you can. You develop relationships with specific vendors whose milk seems to cause fewer problems than others. You sniff and taste before buying, though your senses can't detect the most dangerous contaminants. You pay attention to which babies in your neighbourhood are thriving and which are sickening, trying to correlate outcomes with milk sources. You become an amateur detective, gathering information from other mothers, pooling observations, constructing a mental map of the local milk economy that helps you avoid the worst suppliers. Some families keep their own cows, if they have space and can afford the investment. A healthy cow in a backyard stable produces fresh milk daily, eliminating the contamination risks of the commercial supply chain. But urban housing rarely accommodates livestock, and maintaining a cow requires labour, feed, and veterinary care that many families can't provide. The occasional escaped cow wandering through city streets is a reminder that some neighbours have attempted this solution, usually with mixed success. A particularly grim detail: some swill dairies sell milk from cows that are actively dying of disease. As animals sicken beyond any possibility of recovery, they're kept alive just long enough to extract final value from their bodies. The milk from these dying cows may be visibly abnormal, streaked with blood, thick with pus from infected udders, but it still enters the commercial supply, mixed with healthier batches to dilute the obvious contamination. You have no way of knowing whether the milk in your cup contains these horrifying components. The chemistry of bacterial contamination was beyond 19th century understanding, but people observed patterns that hinted at the truth. Milk spoiled faster in summer than in winter. Babies sickened more often when milk sat out for long periods. Fresh milk seemed safer than milk that had travelled long distances. These observations led some families to adopt practices that happened to reduce contamination. Buying milk early in the morning, keeping it in the coolest available location, discarding any that showed signs of souring, without understanding the microbial mechanisms at work. Ice begins to change the equation, though only for those who can afford it. An icebox stocked with blocks cut from frozen ponds can keep milk cool enough to slow bacterial growth significantly. But ice costs money, and iceboxes cost money, and the poor families most dependent on commercial milk are the least able to afford these protective technologies. The class divide widens further. Wealthy babies survive on refrigerated milk from clean sources, while poor babies die on warm swill milk from diseased cows. The reformers who eventually challenge the swill milk trade do so on moral, as much as medical grounds. They frame the issue as a matter of justice, innocent babies murdered by corporate greed, and demand government intervention to protect the vulnerable. Their arguments resonate because infant death touches something deep in human psychology. Even in an era accustomed to childhood mortality, the image of babies killed by deliberate adulteration provokes outrage that transcends political divisions. Change will come, eventually. Pasteurization, milk inspection laws, licensing requirements for dairies. These reforms will gradually transform the American milk supply from a vector of death into a relatively safe food product. But those changes lie in the future. For now, in this brutal summer, you do what you can with what you have, and you pray that the milk you're feeding your baby isn't the swill milk that will end this small life before it truly begins. The ice arrives on a cart drawn by a tired horse, delivered by a man whose arms have grown thick from years of hauling frozen blocks. You've arranged for a weekly delivery, more than you can really afford but less than you need, and you watch as he uses iron tongs to grip a 50-pound block and carry it to your kitchen. The ice sweats in the morning heat, already diminished from its original size, but still cold enough to make your fingers ache when you touch it. This frozen water, cut from a Massachusetts pond last January, will help keep your baby alive through another July week. The ice trade is one of the great commercial innovations of 19th-century America, and its impact on infant survival is difficult to overstate. Before ice became widely available, families had essentially no way to preserve perishable food during hot weather. Milk spoiled within hours, meat rotted overnight. Any food that required cooling simply couldn't be kept. The wealthy might have access to natural ice houses, underground chambers packed with winter ice and insulated with straw, but ordinary families had nothing. Summer meant accepting spoilage as inevitable. Then came Frederick Tudor, the Ice King of Boston, who in the early 1800s began the seemingly insane project of shipping New England ice to warm climates. His first attempts were failures. The ice melted, the ships leaked, customers didn't understand what they were buying, but Tudor persisted, developing better insulation techniques and creating demand through aggressive marketing. By the 1850s, the ice trade has become a major industry, with thousands of workers cutting blocks from frozen lakes each winter and storing them in massive ice houses for distribution throughout the year. Your ice comes from this supply chain, though you don't know the specific pond or the specific workers involved. You only know that the Iceman arrives each week, that his product costs money you'd rather spend on other things, and that without it your baby's chances of surviving summer drop precipitously. The icebox in your kitchen, a wooden cabinet lined with zinc or tin, with a compartment on top for the ice block and shelves below for food, represents both modern convenience and ancient necessity. Humans have always needed to preserve food. Ice finally makes it possible on a household scale. The logistics of ice preservation occupy considerable mental energy. You position the milk pitcher directly beneath the ice block, where melting cold water drips steadily, keeping the liquid as cool as possible. You plan your purchases around delivery days, buying more perishables when fresh ice has just arrived, and reducing purchases as the block dwindles. You monitor the rate of melting, adjusting the icebox's drainage and insulation to maximize the ice's lifespan. On particularly hot days, you stuff newspapers and rags around the ice block, trying to squeeze a few more hours of cold from the diminishing resource. The difference this makes for infant survival operates through multiple mechanisms. Cool milk spoils more slowly, meaning bacteria have less time to multiply to dangerous levels. Cool water can hydrate an overheated baby more effectively than warm water. Cool cloths applied to feverish skin can break dangerous temperature spikes. Even the psychological comfort of having something cold in the house, a resource, a tool, a weapon against the heat, reduces the desperate helplessness that summer induces. You're not powerless against the season. You have ice, but ice is never quite enough. The blocks melt relentlessly, transforming from solid asset to spreading puddle on the kitchen floor. The delivery schedule doesn't always align with your needs. If your ice runs out on Thursday and the Iceman doesn't come until Monday, you face 3 days of dangerous warmth. The cost accumulates week after week, straining your budget and forcing choices between competing necessities. You can have ice, or you can have meat. You can have ice, or you can have new shoes for your older child. These calculations seem absurd from a 21st century perspective, but they're deadly serious in your world. Some families share ice costs with neighbours, splitting deliveries and managing the logistics collectively. Your street has organised an informal ice cooperative, where 3 families receive deliveries on a rotating schedule and share the resulting supply. The arrangement requires trust and coordination. If one family takes more than their fair share, the others suffer, but it stretches scarce resources further than any household could manage alone. Community cooperation once again proves essential to survival. A quirky detail: the ice that arrives at your door may have travelled thousands of miles from its frozen origin. Tudor and his competitors ship ice as far as India and the Caribbean, where wealthy colonials pay premium prices for the miraculous frozen water. The ice that chills your baby's milk in Pennsylvania might be chemically identical to ice being used right now to make ice cream in Calcutta. The global reach of the ice trade is one of the stranger features of 19th-century commerce, connecting frozen New England ponds to tropical markets in ways that seem almost magical. The labour of ice cutting deserves acknowledgement, even if you never witness it directly. Each winter, thousands of men venture onto frozen lakes and ponds, scoring the surface into grids, sawing blocks free, and hauling them up ramps into waiting wagons. It's brutal work in brutal conditions, and injuries are common. The workers are often Irish immigrants, desperate for any paying labour, and their frozen winter suffering enables your summer survival. The ice you touch carries their labour within it, crystallised like the water itself. You've experimented with making your own ice, or at least making things cold through evaporative cooling. A porous clay pot filled with water and set in a breeze will lose heat as the water evaporates through its walls, a technique that dates back to ancient Egypt. A wet cloth wrapped around a bottle of milk, hung in a drafty spot, stays cooler than the surrounding air. These methods help at the margins but can't approach the effectiveness of actual ice. You use them when the icebox stands empty and necessity drives innovation. The wealthy, naturally, have advantages that mock your careful rationing. Their iceboxes are larger, their deliveries more frequent, their blocks thicker and better insulated. Some wealthy families have ice houses on their own properties, underground chambers where enormous quantities of ice can be stored to last all summer. Their babies drink milk that's been kept consistently cold from cow to cup, while yours drinks milk that's been lukewarm for hours before the weekly delivery finally arrives. The class gradient of survival appears again, written in frozen water. Historians still argue about whether ice access significantly affected infant mortality rates at the population level, or whether the benefits accrued primarily to already privileged families. The evidence suggests that ice availability did correlate with improved survival, but the correlation is confounded by other factors. Families who could afford ice could often afford better milk, better housing, better medical care. Disentangling the specific contribution of refrigeration from the general contribution of affluence proves difficult. What seems clear is that ice helped, even if quantifying exactly how much remains elusive. Your baby sleeps in the afternoon heat, and you press a cool cloth to that small forehead, refreshing it every few minutes with ice-cold water from the melting block. The sensation seems to provide relief, or at least your baby's breathing eases slightly when the cloth touches skin. You don't know whether this actually prevents heat stroke or merely delays symptoms, but you keep doing it because doing something feels better than doing nothing. The ice is your ally in this fight, and you deploy it strategically, conserving what you can while using what you must. Evening comes, and you count the remaining ice in the box. Maybe 2 more days if you're careful. Maybe 3 if the weather cooperates. The calculation is automatic now, part of your daily mental accounting, as routine as counting the milk left in the pitcher or the candles left in the drawer. Ice is currency in the summer economy, and you're always aware of your balance. The Iceman will return on Monday. Until then, you manage what you have and hope it's enough. You become an engineer of coolness, improvising systems and methods that would impress any modern HVAC technician with their ingenuity if not their effectiveness. The wet sheet hung in the doorway, which your neighbour recommended, actually does work. Water evaporating from the fabric absorbs heat from the surrounding air, dropping the temperature by several degrees in the immediate vicinity. You've refined the technique, soaking multiple sheets and rotating them as each dries, maintaining a continuous evaporative cooling effect that makes the nursery almost bearable during the worst afternoon hours. The physics behind this are simple, though you understand it through observation rather than formal education. Evaporation requires energy, and that energy comes from the heat in the air. The more evaporation you can create, the more heat gets absorbed, the cooler the space becomes. Your wet sheets, your damp cloths, your strategic placement of bowls filled with water, all of these exploit the same principle, turning your home into a primitive evaporative cooling system that works better than nothing but not as well as you'd like. airflow becomes an obsession. You experiment with window arrangements, opening different combinations to find the configuration that produces the best cross-ventilation. You discover that opening windows on opposite walls creates a draft, while opening windows on adjacent walls mostly doesn't. You learn that windows facing different directions catch breezes at different times of day. East-facing windows work better in morning, west-facing in evening, and you adjust your system accordingly. The science of passive cooling was practiced for millennia before air conditioning made it unnecessary, and you're rediscovering ancient wisdom through desperate necessity. Fans provide crucial assistance. You own a handheld fan made from woven palm leaves, purchased at the market for a few cents, and you use it so frequently that your arm aches by evening. Fanning the baby produces visible relief. The small face relaxes, breathing slows, the restless squirming stops. But you can't fan continuously for 16 hours. You recruit your older children to take turns, transforming baby fanning into a family rotation that ensures someone is always providing that precious airflow. On good days, a breeze assists your efforts. On bad days, you're the only source of moving air in a dead calm house. Some families construct more elaborate fanning mechanisms. A device called a punka, or punka, borrowed from Indian colonial practice, consists of a large cloth fan suspended from the ceiling on a frame connected by ropes and pulleys to a spot where someone can pull rhythmically, creating airflow over the entire room. You've seen one in a wealthy family's home, operated by a servant who sits in the corner pulling the rope for hours at a stretch, and you've fantasized about building your own. The mechanical complexity defeats you, though. You lack the carpentry skills and materials to construct the necessary framework. The cellar remains your refuge of last resort, that underground cool zone where temperatures hover 20 or 30 degrees below the brutal surface levels. You've established a routine. During the worst afternoon hours, roughly noon to 4, you descend with the baby and whatever activities you can bring along. Mending, letter writing, simply sitting and waiting. The darkness and the dampness that make the cellar uncomfortable also make it safe, at least from heat stroke. You've accepted the trade-off, preferring the cellar's musty chill to the parlour's suffocating warmth. Strategic building use extends beyond the cellar. You've identified the coolest room in your house, the north-facing bedroom where your husband and you sleep, and you've relocated the baby's cradle there during summer months. The room receives no direct sunlight and stays several degrees cooler than south-facing spaces. You've also learned to use the house's mass as a thermal battery. At night, you open everything and let cool air flush out the heat. At dawn, you close everything and trap the overnight coolness as long as possible. It's a daily cycle of opening and closing, capturing and releasing that requires constant attention, but produces measurable results. A particularly creative neighbour has constructed what amounts to a primitive air conditioning system using ice and a wash tub. He fills the tub with ice, positions a fan to blow across the ice surface, and directs the resulting cold air toward his family's sleeping area. The system works amazingly well. You've visited and felt the chilly breeze with your own hands, but it consumes ice at a rate he can barely afford and produces an enormous puddle as the ice melts. He reserves it for the worst nights, when his youngest child's fever threatens to spike dangerously. Night cooling strategies extend to sleeping arrangements. You've moved your bed onto the back porch, where cooler air circulates and the slight elevation catches breezes that the indoor rooms miss. The arrangement lacks privacy. Neighbours can see you sleeping, and the occasional drunk wanders past making noise, but privacy matters less than survival. Other families sleep on roofs, on lawns, in backyards, anywhere that offers relief from the brick ovens their homes have become. On the hottest nights, entire neighbourhoods pour outside, transforming streets into impromptu bedrooms, and you join this migration, carrying your baby to whatever cool spot you can claim. Historians still argue whether these improvised cooling methods made meaningful differences in infant survival, or whether they merely provided comfort without actually preventing deaths. The evidence is mixed. Keeping a baby cooler probably did reduce heat stroke risk and decrease the metabolic stress that high temperatures impose. But cooling alone couldn't protect against contaminated milk, contaminated water, or the infectious diseases that spread regardless of temperature. You were fighting on multiple fronts, and winning on one didn't guarantee winning on all. Clothing choices intersect with cooling strategies. You dress the baby in the lightest possible fabrics, often just a thin cotton shift, reasoning that less coverage means more heat dissipation. This approach conflicts with advice from some medical authorities who recommend keeping babies warmly wrapped regardless of season. They believe that chilling is more dangerous than overheating, but you've observed that overdressed babies seem to suffer more, not less, during heat waves. You trust your observations over their theories. The labour of keeping cool falls primarily on you as it falls on women throughout this society. Your husband leaves for work each morning and returns in the evening. Between those hours you manage the house, the children, the endless battle against heat. Your cook, nurse, engineer and general contractor, maintaining systems that require constant adjustment and never provide complete comfort. By summer's end, you'll be exhausted in ways that winter, with its different but less relentless demands, rarely produces. Your baby responds to your efforts with the oblivious gratitude of all infants, simply by surviving, simply by continuing to nurse and grow and sleep peacefully through the worst afternoons. You watch that small chest rise and fall, noting the steady rhythm that indicates all is well for now, and you feel a satisfaction that transcends the physical exhaustion. You're winning this fight, one wet sheet and one fan wave at a time. Tomorrow will bring more heat, more improvisation, more creative problem solving in the ongoing war against summer. Tonight, a slight breeze stirs the curtain, and you let yourself hope that the worst has passed for this year. The water you give your baby might be killing it, and you have no way to know for certain. You draw water from the pump at the end of your street, a community resource that serves 24 families, and the pump draws from a well that reaches down into groundwater of uncertain quality. The water looks clear, tastes normal, shows no obvious signs of contamination, but somewhere in its chemical composition or microbial content, danger may be lurking, invisible and patient, waiting for a vulnerable infant system to colonize. The hydration paradox torments mothers throughout 19th-century America. Babies in hot weather need fluids to replace what they lose through sweating and breathing. Breast milk provides ideal hydration, but if you're supplementing with artificial feeding, your baby needs additional water. And yet the water itself may carry cholera, typhoid, dysentery, or any number of other diseases that kill more efficiently than dehydration would. You're trapped between two dangers, trying to thread a needle in the dark. Some authorities recommend boiling water before giving it to infants, reasoning that heat destroys whatever harmful elements might be present. The advice makes intuitive sense, though the mechanism isn't well understood. Germ theory is emerging but not yet dominant, and boiling is recommended more because it seems purifying than because anyone has demonstrated bacterial death under heat. You've adopted the practice, boiling water in a small pot and letting it cool before offering it to your baby, adding precious minutes to already lengthy caregiving routines, but hoping the effort provides protection. Historians still argue whether boiled water significantly reduced infant mortality in this era. The evidence suggests that consistent, thorough boiling did help, but many families boiled inadequately, not long enough to kill pathogens or contaminating the water afterward by storing it in unclean containers. The gap between medical recommendation and actual practice was wide, and mothers working in cramped kitchens with crying babies and multiple other demands couldn't always follow protocols perfectly. You do your best, but your best may not be enough. The symptoms of waterborne illness overlap alarmingly with the symptoms of milk-borne illness, making diagnosis essentially impossible. A baby who develops diarrhea might be reacting to contaminated water, contaminated milk, contaminated food, or some combination. You can't test any of these products for pathogens. You can only observe effects and guess at causes. When your baby's stools turn watery and frequent, you eliminate different items from the diet experimentally, hoping to identify the culprit. But often the illness runs its course before you can isolate any single factor. The well that serves your neighbourhood has a dubious history that everyone knows and nobody discusses openly. 10 years ago, several families got sick simultaneously, and suspicion focused on the pump. A committee was formed to investigate, but no clear contamination source was identified, and the well continued serving the community. You've wondered whether proximity to outhouses and cesspools might be leaching waste into the groundwater. The geography certainly seems suggestive. But you lack the scientific knowledge to assess the risk and the economic resources to obtain water elsewhere. Some families pay for water delivered from springs outside the city, supposedly purer sources untouched by urban contamination. The cost is substantial, but families who can afford it report better health outcomes, which might indicate genuine quality differences. or might simply reflect the correlation between wealth and survival that appears throughout this narrative. You've tried spring water occasionally, during particularly worrying illness episodes, but can't maintain the expense consistently. Your baby drinks pump water, boiled when you remember and time permits, and you hope for the best. The summer complaint, that catch-all term for infant diarrheal disease, almost certainly involves water contamination in many cases, though doctors of this era blame everything from teething to foul air to improper feeding schedules. The progression is grimly familiar. Loose stools, vomiting, rapid dehydration, sunken fontanelle, lethargy, and death within days. Water, which should help prevent dehydration, instead accelerates it when the water itself carries the pathogens causing the diarrhea. The cruel irony of the situation, hydration that kills, remedy that harms, would be almost absurd if it weren't so tragic. You develop rituals around water that border on superstition. You collect the morning's first pump strokes and discard them, reasoning that water sitting in the pump overnight might be more contaminated than water freshly drawn from the well. You store boiled water in a covered pitcher that you wash meticulously before each refill. You won't let anyone else give the baby water unless you've personally verified its source and preparation. These practices might help or might not, but they give you a sense of agency in a situation where agency feels scarce. The taste of boiled water differs subtly from raw water, slightly flat, lacking the crisp freshness of cold from the well, and some babies reject it. You've learned to cool the water thoroughly before offering it, since hot water is unpleasant and room temperature water is tolerable. Your baby accepts the boiled water now, having never known anything else, and you're grateful for this small victory. Ice complicates the water question. Ice cubes might cool water beautifully, but the ice itself comes from ponds whose water quality you can't assess. Frozen contamination remains contamination, and you've heard stories of families sickened by ice cut from polluted waters. You use your ice for cooling milk and creating cold compresses, but you avoid putting it directly in drinking water. The precaution may or may not matter, but it feels right. A quirky practice among some families involves adding small amounts of brandy or wine to infant water, believing that alcohol provides some protective benefit. The practice has medieval roots and continues in some communities despite medical advice to the contrary. You've been offered this advice by well-meaning neighbours and have politely declined, intuiting that alcohol and infant systems don't mix well, even if you can't articulate exactly why. Some risks feel wrong in ways that transcend scientific explanation. Rain collection offers a theoretical alternative water source, but in practice proves difficult. Urban air carries soot, dust and contaminants that settle into collected rainwater, potentially making it as dangerous as well water. Rural families in cleaner environments might successfully use rain collection, but you're stuck in a city where the rain itself seems dirty before it even hits the ground. Your baby survives another day, hydrated by water you've done your best to purify, and you mark the small victory against the large uncertainty. Tomorrow you'll boil more water, store it carefully, offer it in measured doses, and continue navigating the paradox that defines infant care in this era. Everything the baby needs might also be the thing that kills it. The pump handle squeaks as you work it, filling your bucket for tomorrow's use. The water flows clear and cold, innocent looking as anything could be. You carry it home with the careful attention it deserves. The bundle of fabric you're unwrapping feels like a puzzle, wrapped in a riddle surrounded by a debate. Your baby lies on the changing table, actually just a towel spread on your bed, while you consider the day's clothing choice, a decision that carries more weight than modern parents could possibly imagine. The medical authorities you've consulted offer advice that contradicts itself at every turn, and the older women in your neighbourhood hold opinions as firm as they are varied. One school of thought insists that babies must be kept warm regardless of season. This tradition descends from centuries of practice, rooted in the observation that cold kills infants through chilling diseases and in the theory that warmth promotes proper development. Adherents swaddle their babies tightly in multiple layers: cotton undergarments, wool outer garments, knitted caps, booties, creating packages so thick that the actual infant seems almost incidental to the surrounding fabric. These mothers view the summer heat as a reason for vigilance, not adaptation. If anything, they worry that summer warmth makes parents complacent, leading them to underdress babies who then catch chills from sudden temperature drops. The opposing school argues that hot weather demands hot weather clothing, minimal coverage, light fabrics, bare limbs that can dissipate heat. These mothers dress their babies in thin cotton shifts or even just diapers, exposing as much skin as possible to whatever breezes the environment provides. They cite common sense, adults don't wrap themselves in wool during July, and observation. Overdressed babies seem more distressed, more feverish, more lethargic than those dressed lightly. Medical reformers increasingly endorse this approach, writing pamphlets about the dangers of overheating and the benefits of allowing infant bodies to regulate temperature naturally. You stand between these camps, uncertain which path leads to survival. Your instinct says that less is more during heat waves. You can see the baby sweating through heavy layers, can feel the clammy heat radiating from overdressed skin. But instinct failed your neighbour's baby last summer, the one who caught a chill and died of some respiratory ailment, and you wonder if more layers might have saved that child. The uncertainty paralyses you, and you end up compromising. A light cotton gown during the day, slightly heavier covering at night, constant adjustment based on the baby's apparent comfort level. Historians still argue whether clothing choices significantly affected infant mortality rates, or whether the debate was largely symbolic, a way for anxious parents to feel they were doing something meaningful in a situation where so many factors lay beyond their control. The evidence is frustratingly thin. Some studies suggest that overheating contributed to infant deaths through heat stroke and dehydration. Others find no clear correlation between dressing practices and outcomes. What seems clear is that both extremes carried risks. Severe overheating killed and severe chilling killed, while moderate approaches probably worked best. The baby's body itself provides feedback that you learn to read. A flushed face suggests overheating. Remove a layer. Bluish lips suggest chilling. Add a layer. Sweaty skin in skin folds suggest too much coverage. Cool, dry skin suggests appropriate coverage. You become an expert in infant physiology through pure observation, developing intuitions that no medical text taught you and that you couldn't articulate if asked. The knowledge lives in your hands, in your ability to assess temperature through touch, in the automatic responses you've cultivated through months of constant vigilance. Diapers constitute their own sub-debate within the clothing conversation. Traditional practice involves wrapping the baby's lower body in multiple layers of cloth, an inner absorbent layer, outer protective layers, sometimes a waterproof covering made from oiled silk or linen. This arrangement keeps waste contained but also traps heat and moisture against the baby's skin, creating conditions perfect for diaper rash and the infections that can follow. Progressive reformers advocate for frequent changing and minimal covering, arguing that keeping the diaper area as cool and dry as possible prevents the skin breakdown that leads to serious problems. You change diapers obsessively, sometimes 6 or 8 times daily during the worst heat, trying to stay ahead of the moisture that accumulates with every urination. Each change is an inspection, examining the skin for redness, for sores, for any sign of the breakdown you dread. When rash appears despite your efforts, you apply whatever remedy is fashionable in your neighbourhood: zinc powder, rice starch, goose grease, and hope it helps. The rash usually resolves eventually, but during its worst phases the baby screams at every diaper change, and you feel the helpless frustration of causing pain in the service of prevention. Clothing laundering becomes summer drudgery that never ends. Babies generate astonishing amounts of dirty laundry under normal circumstances, and summer multiplies the burden. Sweat-soaked garments need washing daily, not weekly. Diapers accumulate in malodorous piles that must be processed before they attract flies and breed disease. You spend hours each week bent over wash basins, scrubbing with soap and water that leave your hands raw, wringing out fabric that seems to absorb more liquid than physics should allow. The image of the serene Victorian mother, gracefully tending her infant, omits the relentless physical labour that kept those babies in clean clothing. A quirky fashion detail. Some mothers dress their babies in long gowns that extend far below the feet, trailing like wedding trains. The practice has various justifications: ease of diaper access, prevention of kicking off covers, tradition, but makes little practical sense in hot weather when excess fabric creates excess warmth. You've shortened your baby's gowns, hemming them to ankle length, scandalising a neighbour who considers the modification both dangerous and improper. Fashion, even infant fashion, operates by rules you find increasingly absurd as summer's urgency clarifies your priorities. The baby you've dressed this morning wears a cotton shift, white and thin, and nothing else. No cap, no booties, no additional layers. The outfit would horrify your grandmother, but satisfies your own assessment of conditions, hot, still, dangerous. You'll monitor throughout the day, adding or subtracting coverage as temperatures change and the baby's feedback suggests. The clothing becomes another variable in your ongoing calculation of survival odds, one more dial you adjust in the complex system you're managing. Nighttime brings its own clothing dilemmas. The temperature drops, but not always enough to matter, and the baby sleeps more heavily when comfortable, but what constitutes comfortable changes hour by hour as the night cools. You've developed a layering system. Start the night with minimal coverage, add a light blanket around midnight, add a heavier blanket near dawn when temperatures reach their lowest. The system requires waking periodically to check and adjust, fragmenting your sleep further, but you've accepted this cost as part of the overall summer survival strategy. The morning advances, and your dressed baby rests contentedly in the cradle, apparently comfortable in the chosen outfit. Tomorrow you'll make the same decisions again, navigating the same contradictory advice, reading the same subtle physical cues. The clothing debate continues in your neighbourhood, in medical journals, in mothers' gatherings where opinions are shared and contested. You participate when asked, but privately trust your own observations more than any external authority. Your baby's comfort is the only verdict that matters. The basin of water sits on the floor, tepid and waiting, while you consider whether today is a bathing day or not. The question seems simple, but opens onto a vast terrain of medical controversy, folk wisdom, and practical experience that you've been navigating since your baby's birth. Bathing an infant in 19th-century America is never just bathing. It's a statement about your beliefs, your modernity, your willingness to accept or reject received wisdom. The traditional view holds that bathing too frequently weakens infants by chilling their systems and opening their pores to dangerous influences. This perspective, rooted in ancient humoral theory, treats water exposure as inherently risky, a necessary evil to be minimized. Adherents bathe their babies perhaps once weekly, or even less frequently, using brief sponge wipes rather than full immersion. They cite experience, tradition, and the authority of physicians who trained in the old school. They point to babies who caught cold after bathing and died, to the chills that water produces, to the obvious distress many infants show when placed in water. The progressive view insists that cleanliness promotes health, and that frequent bathing, properly conducted, strengthens rather than weakens infant constitutions. This perspective, gaining ground among reform-minded doctors and educated urban mothers, treats regular bathing as essential hygiene. Adherents bathe their babies daily, or even more often during hot weather, using full immersion in water of carefully measured temperature. They cite science, or what passes for science in this era, and the observed benefits of clean skin, reduced rash, and improved comfort. You've landed somewhere in the middle, as you do on so many infant care questions. Your baby gets a full bath every other day, more frequently during heat waves when sweat and grime accumulate faster. You've developed a protocol through trial and error. Water temperature warm but not hot. You test it with your elbow, an ancient technique that actually works. Bathing duration brief, a few minutes, enough to clean without chilling. Drying immediate and thorough, patting dry rather than rubbing to avoid skin irritation, and timing chosen to avoid both the cool of morning and the peak heat of afternoon. Historians still argue whether bathing practices significantly affected infant survival rates, or whether the debate was mostly noise surrounding a practice that mattered less than everyone believed. The evidence is inconclusive. Clean skin probably did help prevent infections, and cooling baths probably did help regulate temperature during heat waves. But bathing alone couldn't counteract contaminated milk, contaminated water, or the other major killers of this era. You were adjusting one variable in a complex equation where many variables lay beyond your control. The temperature debate generates particular passion among both traditional and progressive camps. Cool water, say some authorities, stimulates the constitution and hardens the baby against illness. Warm water, say others, relaxes and comforts without the shock of cold. Cold water, say a few extremists, provides the ultimate strengthening effect. Babies who survive cold water immersion develop robust constitutions. Hot water, say nobody reputable, since everyone agrees that hot water is dangerous. You've settled on lukewarm body temperature water that produces minimal reaction from your baby, and you feel quietly rebellious in refusing to take sides. The bathing ritual has become one of the more pleasant moments in your day, a respite from the anxiety and vigilance that characterize most infant care. Your baby has come to enjoy the water, kicking and splashing in the basin with something approaching delight. You sing softly while bathing, an old song your mother sang to you, and the melody seems to calm you both. The water washes away the day's accumulated sweat and grime, the dried milk residue, the faint staleness that even well-tended babies develop in hot weather. Afterward, your baby smells fresh, skin soft and clean, and you feel a momentary triumph over the summer's degradations. Summer bathing carries specific benefits beyond general hygiene. The evaporative cooling effect of wet skin provides relief that can last for precious minutes after the bath ends. A baby bathed at noon, during the worst heat, emerges noticeably more comfortable than before entering the water. You've learned to time baths strategically, using them as temperature management tools rather than just cleanliness routines. A bath at 4 in the afternoon, when temperatures peak, can break a developing fever and restore equilibrium that seemed lost. Some mothers go further, using cold water baths or cold water sponging as therapeutic interventions for feverish babies. The practice is controversial. Cold shock seems dangerous to many, but has its advocates among physicians who believe that bringing down a high temperature quickly can prevent brain damage or death. You've never quite dared to try truly cold water, but you've used cooler than usual baths during frightening fever episodes, watching anxiously as your baby's skin contact with the water produces visible relief. Whether this constitutes good medicine or desperate improvisation, you honestly can't say. A quirky bathing practice some families employ involves adding various substances to the bath water. Salt, believed to strengthen and toughen the skin. Bran or oatmeal, believed to soften and soothe irritated skin. Vinegar, believed to have antiseptic properties. Herbs like chamomile or lavender, believed to calm fussy babies and promote sleep. You've experimented with several of these additives, finding that oatmeal does seem to help with mild rashes and that lavender produces a pleasant scent, but you can't honestly claim any dramatic effects. The practical challenges of bathing accumulate in ways that modern parents, with their convenient bathtubs and instant hot water, might not appreciate. The water must be hauled from the pump and heated on the stove, an effort that takes time and fuel. The basin must be positioned safely, away from drafts and at a height that doesn't strain your back. Towels must be warmed and ready, supplies arranged within arm's reach, because once you have a wet, slippery baby in your hands, you can't go searching for forgotten items. The logistics of bathing are complex enough that you understand why some mothers minimize the practice. It's genuinely difficult to do well. Your baby lies in the basin now, water lapping gently, small limbs waving in the unfamiliar medium. The face shows contentment, or at least absence of distress. You scoop water with your cupped hand and let it trickle over the baby's chest, washing away the morning's accumulation of summer. The moment feels almost sacred, this ancient ritual of cleansing, this tender care of vulnerable flesh, this small life entirely dependent on your hands. The bath ends, the drying proceeds, and your clean baby rests in the cradle, fresh-smelling and comfortable. Tomorrow or the next day you'll do it again, navigating the same debates, making the same practical compromises, finding the same small pleasures in a practice that everyone has an opinion about, and nobody fully understands. The fear arrives first as a smell, the unmistakable odour of diarrhea that has progressed beyond normal into something worse. You rush to the cradle and find what you dreaded. Your baby lying listless, diaper soaked with watery greenish stool, eyes half closed with an exhaustion that seems far deeper than ordinary sleepiness. Cholera infantum has found your household, and the fight you've been dreading all summer has finally begun. The name itself, cholera infantum, sounds almost elegant, a Latin designation that medical professionals use to describe the constellation of symptoms that kills more babies than any other summer ailment. Diarrhea, vomiting, rapid dehydration, fever, lethargy, and death, often within days or even hours of the first symptoms. The disease strikes with brutal efficiency, overwhelming infant systems that lack the reserves to withstand the fluid loss. A baby can seem fine at breakfast and be dying by supper, the progression so rapid that treatment barely has time to begin before it becomes irrelevant. You don't know what causes cholera infantum because nobody knows, not really. The term covers a range of conditions, bacterial infections, viral infections, parasitic infections, that 19th century medicine can't distinguish. The common denominator is the baby's gut, under assault from contaminated milk or water or food, responding with the explosive purging that characterizes the disease. What you do know, through hard observation, is that breastfed babies get it less often than bottle-fed babies, that clean conditions seem to help, and that once the disease takes hold, the odds shift dramatically against survival. The doctor arrives within the hour, a bearded man with a black bag whose presence would have comforted you more before you learned how little doctors actually understand about infant illness. He examines your baby with the practiced efficiency of someone who has seen this presentation countless times, checking the fontanelle, sunken, a bad sign. The skin elasticity, poor, another bad sign. The degree of alertness, minimal, the worst sign yet. His expression remains professionally neutral, but you can read the calculation behind his eyes. This baby is seriously ill. The treatments he offers range from useless to actively harmful, though you won't learn this until decades later, when medical science finally catches up to the reality of diarrheal disease. He prescribes calomel, the mercury-based purgative that will accelerate the very fluid loss killing your baby. He prescribes laudanum, the opium preparation that will quiet the suffering, but also suppress the vital functions that need to remain active. He prescribes brandy or whiskey to strengthen the constitution, adding alcohol to a system already in crisis. Each of these interventions represents the best medical thinking of the era, and each makes the situation worse. You follow the doctor's orders because you don't know what else to do. The alternative, doing nothing, watching passively while your baby dies, seems unbearable. At least with treatment, you're taking action, fighting back, demonstrating that you refuse to surrender without resistance. The calomel goes down, producing the expected violent reaction. The laudanum goes down, producing the expected drowsy calm. The brandy goes down, producing nothing you can observe. And the diarrhea continues, relentless, each episode carrying away more of the fluid your baby cannot spare. Historians still argue whether medical intervention improved or worsened outcomes for cholera infantum patients in this era. The evidence strongly suggests that aggressive treatment actually increased mortality. Babies who received heroic medical interventions died at higher rates than those treated with simple nursing care and fluid replacement. The doctors weren't villains. They were working within a paradigm that valued active intervention and distrusted the body's natural healing capacities. But their paradigm was wrong, and babies paid the price. The night becomes a vigil. You sit beside the cradle, unable to sleep, watching your baby's breathing and checking for signs of improvement or deterioration. The skin feels papery, loose, a texture you've never encountered before and that terrifies you. The crying has stopped, replaced by a silence more ominous than any wail. You offer water, the boiled water you've been so careful to prepare, but the baby won't drink, turning away from the cup with the weak motion that indicates profound illness. Neighbours begin to call, word having spread through the mysterious communication network that connects mothers in your community. They bring remedies, herbal teas, special broths, prayers written on paper and meant to be tucked under the baby's pillow. Mrs. Hennessy recommends a patent medicine she swears saved her nephew. Mrs. O'Brien recommends constant nursing, even if the baby seems uninterested, as the breast provides comfort and hydration that nothing else can match. Mrs. Schmidt recommends sending for a priest just in case, because preparation for the worst is its own form of hope. You try everything and nothing works. The remedies are either inert or harmful, the prayers seemingly unanswered, the medical interventions producing side effects without benefits. The baby's condition stabilizes briefly, you dare to hope, and then resumes its downward trajectory. The fontanelle sinks further, the eyes grow more sunken. The breathing takes on a quality that someone describes in a phrase that will haunt you as like a bird's. Dawn arrives, and with it a strange clarity. You realize you may be watching your baby die, that all your careful preparations, all your vigilant mother work, all your efforts to thread the needle of summer survival have come to nothing. The realization produces not panic, but a kind of exhausted calm. You've done everything you could, and if everything isn't enough, that isn't your fault. The thought feels like surrender and like freedom simultaneously. But the baby doesn't die. Not this hour, not the next, not by noon when the doctor returns with his bag of ineffective remedies. The diarrhea slows, slightly. The breathing steadies slightly. The eyes open, briefly, meeting yours with something approaching recognition. You've entered the uncertain territory where survival becomes possible again. where the body's own resources have somehow held out against the assault long enough to begin mounting a defence. The recovery, if it happens, will be slow. Weeks of careful nursing, gradual rehydration, slow return to normal feeding patterns. Your baby will be weak for a long time, susceptible to relapse, forever carrying some invisible damage from this episode, but alive, potentially, miraculously, against all odds, alive. You realise you're crying, the first tears since this crisis began. The release feels necessary, a purging of the fear and tension you've been holding. The neighbours who've been attending you retreat to give you privacy, and you sit alone with your baby, letting the tears flow while the morning light strengthens through the window. Cholera infantum doesn't always kill. Sometimes the babies survive. Sometimes the desperate fight ends not in a tiny grave, but in the ordinary miracle of continued life. The letter from your cousin in Ohio arrived last week, and you've been reading it repeatedly, savouring the descriptions of country life that seem almost fantastical from your urban vantage point. The baby thrives in this clean air, she writes. We have our own cow, our own well, gardens that produce more than we can eat. The heat is bearable because breezes blow through, and the nights actually cool down enough for sleeping. The contrast with your own situation, cramped housing, contaminated milk, stagnant air, makes you simultaneously envious and sceptical. Is rural life really that much better, or is your cousin painting a rosier picture than reality warrants? The belief that country living promotes infant survival has deep roots in 19th-century American culture. Reformers constantly contrast the deadly urban environment with the wholesome countryside, describing cities as cesspools of disease and farms as havens of health. The statistics seem to support this view. Infant mortality rates in rural areas are generally lower than in cities, sometimes dramatically so. Babies born on farms appear to survive their first summers at rates that urban parents can only dream of. But the rural advantage, while real, is neither absolute nor magical. Farm babies still die of cholera infantum, still succumb to the same diarrheal diseases that devastate urban nurseries. The difference lies in degree rather than kind. Country babies face lower risk, not no risk. The advantages are multiple and compound. Cleaner water from private wells, fresher milk from family cows, better ventilation in less crowded housing, more space to escape the worst heat, and fewer opportunities for disease to spread from household to household in dense populations. You've considered sending your baby to the country for the summer, a practice that some urban families employ. A cousin, an aunt, a family friend with a farm might take in the infant for the dangerous months, returning the child in September when temperatures moderate. The arrangement would cost money you don't have and would require trust you're not sure you can extend. Your baby cared for by someone else's hands, in someone else's home, beyond your constant surveillance. The thought produces anxiety that overwhelms the potential benefits. The fresh air movement, gaining momentum among public health reformers, advocates exactly this kind of rural relocation for vulnerable urban infants. Organisations are forming to facilitate summer transfers, matching city babies with country families willing to house them temporarily. The movement will grow more systematic in coming decades, eventually creating networks of fresh air farms and summer programs that bring thousands of tenement children to rural environments each year. You're witnessing the beginning of a social innovation, though you can't know yet how large it will eventually become. Historians still argue whether the fresh air movement actually saved lives or merely shifted the location of some deaths from city to country. The evidence is mixed. Babies who survived the transfer to a healthy rural environment did benefit from cleaner conditions. But the transfer itself carried risks. The journey by wagon or train exposed fragile infants to new dangers, and not all rural hosts provided the quality of care that fresh air advocates assumed. Some babies died in transit or shortly after arrival, having traded one set of risks for another. The rural families who accept urban babies do so for various reasons. Some are genuinely altruistic, moved by reformers' appeals to help save innocent lives. Some are compensated financially, adding a summer boarder's income to farm budgets that might otherwise be tight. Some are extended family members, aunts and grandmothers who want to help but live too far away for regular visits. The motivations vary, and so does the quality of care. Your baby, entrusted to the wrong rural family, might receive neglect that would never occur under your own supervision. Farm life has its own dangers that city dwellers sometimes overlook. Agricultural accidents claim children as well as adults. falls from haylofts, kicks from horses, drownings in farm ponds. Agricultural diseases like tetanus lurk in the soil, ready to infect any wound. The very isolation that protects against contagion also means that help is far away when emergencies occur. A rural baby with cholera infantum might die simply because the nearest doctor is too many miles distant to arrive in time. You decide ultimately not to send your baby away. The decision comes from instinct as much as reasoning. You can't bear to be separated from this small person whose survival has consumed your every waking thought. If your baby is going to die, you want to be present, holding, comforting, doing whatever can be done. If your baby is going to live, you want to be present for that too, claiming credit for the vigilance that made survival possible. The country, however healthful, would exclude you from your own child's fate, and that exclusion feels unacceptable. A quirky detail of the rural-urban comparison. Some 19th-century observers note that enslaved babies in the rural South had higher survival rates than free babies in northern cities. The observation is factually accurate but morally complex. Enslaved families had access to some material advantages, fresh food, clean water, outdoor air, that desperately poor urban families lacked. But those advantages came at the cost of freedom, and within a system designed to extract maximum labour value from human bodies. Survival is not the same as flourishing, and statistics that ignore context can mislead. Your cousin's letter sits on the table, a window into an alternative life you won't be living this summer. You imagine your baby there, crawling across a clean farmhouse floor, drinking milk that came from a healthy cow that morning, sleeping peacefully in a room where breezes actually blow through open windows. The fantasy is beautiful, seductive, and ultimately irrelevant. You're here, in this city, with this baby facing this summer. The rural paradise remains a dream. Summer continues its assault, and you continue your resistance with the tools available. The country might be better, might not, might offer salvation or simply different dangers. You'll never know because you're not going. Your baby will survive this summer or not right here, in this hot box of a house, under your exhausted but unrelenting supervision. The letter goes back in its envelope, to be reread when you need a moment of vicarious escape. Your cousin's baby thrives in Ohio. Your baby fights for survival in Pennsylvania. The same country, the same summer, different odds. Night falls, and you prepare for the hours of darkness that bring their own particular terrors. The question of where your baby will sleep has no obvious answer, only trade-offs and risks that you weigh against each other in the fading light. Every option feels dangerous in some way, and the best you can do is choose the danger you find most manageable. Bed sharing is the traditional practice, the way mothers have slept with infants for millennia. You pull your baby close, nestled in the curve of your body, and the warmth is comforting to you both. Nursing in the night becomes seamless. The baby stirs, latches without fully waking, feeds, drifts back to sleep, and you barely have to rouse yourself to meet the demand. The closeness allows you to monitor breathing, temperature and condition continuously, catching any change immediately. On cool nights, this arrangement works beautifully, but summer transforms bed sharing into something more complicated. The combined body heat of two people, one generating adult warmth, one generating infant warmth, can raise the temperature in the shared space to dangerous levels. You wake sweating, find your baby sweating more, and wonder if the closeness that comforts in winter threatens in summer. The risk of overlying, always present, seems greater when everyone is exhausted from heat-disturbed sleep and might roll or shift without waking. The blankets and pillows that make the adult bed comfortable for you could smother a small body that ends up pressed against them. The cradle offers an alternative, keeping the baby in a separate sleeping space while remaining within arm's reach. Your cradle is a simple wooden box on rockers, lined with a thin mattress and positioned beside your bed where you can touch it in the dark. The baby sleeps alone but not distant, and you can reach out to rock the cradle, check the temperature, or soothe without fully rising. The arrangement provides more airflow around the baby's body, reducing the overheating risk while maintaining the monitoring access that bed sharing provides. But the cradle has its own dangers. A baby alone in a cradle can be forgotten during deep parental sleep, her cries unheard, her fever spiking without detection. The mattress, however thin, can bunch or shift, creating suffocation risks. The rockers can tip if bumped by a restless sleeper or by older children running through the room. Nothing is perfectly safe, and the choice between bed and cradle is really a choice between different profiles of risk. Historians still argue whether bed sharing increased or decreased infant mortality in this era. The evidence is contradictory. Some studies find higher death rates among co-sleeping infants, attributed to suffocation by overlying or entanglement in bedding. Other studies find lower death rates, attributed to better thermoregulation and faster parental response to distress. The truth probably varied with circumstances. A sober mother in a sparsely furnished bed might safely co-sleep, while an exhausted father after drinking might pose real danger. The variables were too numerous to isolate, and blanket advice in either direction missed important nuances. Summer adds the heat variable to an already complex equation. On the hottest nights, even the cradle might not provide enough separation. The entire room becomes an oven, and no sleeping arrangement can compensate for ambient temperatures that exceed what infant bodies can handle. You've experimented with various solutions, moving the cradle near an open window, better airflow but risk of night air and insects, placing a bowl of ice near the cradle to cool the surrounding air, helpful but ice consumptive, sleeping on the floor with the baby rather than in the elevated bed, cooler but harder on your aching back. The fear of suffocation haunts parents throughout history, but 19th-century Americans seem particularly anxious about it. Overlaying appears in medical literature and newspaper accounts as a common cause of infant death, though historians now suspect that some reported overlaying cases were actually sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, or other unexplained deaths that got attributed to parental carelessness because the culture needed someone to blame. A mother whose baby died mysteriously during the night might face not only grief, but suspicion, accusation, perhaps even legal consequences if neighbours convinced themselves she had rolled onto her child. You've heard the stories, and they fuel your vigilance. The woman on the next street whose baby was found cold and lifeless one morning, the whispers that followed, the hints that she'd been drinking, the suggestions that her poverty and exhaustion made her less careful than a mother should be. You don't know whether the stories are true or merely neighbourhood gossip, but you feel their pressure every night as you arrange yourself and your baby for sleep. A quirky sleeping practice some families employ involves the baby hammock, a suspended cloth bed that hangs from ceiling hooks and sways gently with the baby's movements. Proponents argue that the hammock provides better air circulation than any stationary sleeping surface, that the swaying motion soothes babies into deeper sleep, and that the elevated position keeps infants away from floor-level dust and insects. You've considered constructing one, but worry about the hammock tipping or the hooks failing, depositing your baby onto the hard floor below. The night proceeds in fragments. You sleep briefly, wake to check the baby, sleep again, wake to nurse, sleep once more, wake to wonder if the silence means peaceful slumber or something worse. The rhythm is exhausting, and by morning you feel barely rested, but this is the reality of infant care in any era. Sleep deprivation as a baseline condition, briefly interrupted by actual sleep. Dawn arrives, and your baby wakes healthy, hungry, ready for another day. The night's fears dissolve in morning light, replaced by the daytime fears that will occupy you until evening. The sleeping arrangement worked this time, and you'll repeat it tonight with the same combination of calculation and prayer that characterizes every parenting decision you make. Tomorrow might demand adjustments, different positioning, different arrangements, different compromises. For now, you lift your baby from the cradle and begin again. The buzzing starts at dawn and doesn't stop until darkness finally brings relief. Mosquitoes, flies, gnats, and a menagerie of other flying irritants have found your household and seem determined to make your baby's life miserable. Without window screens, without insect repellent, without any of the modern defences that make summer insects merely annoying rather than genuinely dangerous, you're fighting a battle that feels hopeless from the start. Mosquitoes pose the greatest threat, though you don't know precisely why. You observe that mosquito bites lead to swelling, itching, and sometimes infection. And you've heard vague rumours about mosquitoes carrying disease, but the connection between mosquitoes and malaria won't be definitively established until later in the century. What you know is that mosquitoes are maddening, that their bites torment babies who can't scratch or swat, and that preventing bites feels important even if you can't articulate exactly what you're preventing beyond immediate discomfort. Your primary defence is netting, fine mesh fabric draped over the cradle to create a barrier between your baby and the insect world. You purchased the netting at the dry goods store, paying more than you wanted for a quantity that barely covers the cradle adequately. The fabric is delicate, tears easily, and requires constant adjustment to maintain its protective function. Gaps appear where the netting bunches or doesn't quite reach the cradle's edges, and determined mosquitoes find these gaps with infuriating efficiency. The trade-off, as with everything, involves airflow. Netting dense enough to exclude mosquitoes also impedes the breezes you desperately need for cooling. On the hottest days, you face an impossible choice: seal the baby under netting and risk overheating, or remove the netting and invite the mosquitoes to feast. You compromise by using the netting during dawn and dusk, peak mosquito hours, and removing it during midday when the insects are less active and the heat is most dangerous. Flies represent a different kind of threat. Houseflies don't bite, but they land on everything: food, waste, skin, transferring whatever contamination their feet have collected. A fly that walked across the manure pile in the neighbour's yard and then landed on your baby's face has potentially introduced pathogens that could cause serious illness. You wave flies away constantly, a reflex action that has become so automatic you barely notice doing it. But you can't maintain vigilance every moment, and the flies take advantage of any lapse. Flypaper offers some relief. These sticky strips hung from ceiling beams trap flies that land on them, gradually accumulating a disgusting collection of dead and dying insects. Your parlour has 3 strips, which you replace weekly when they become too covered with bodies to trap more. The sight is unpleasant, and the smell as the accumulated flies decompose is worse. But the alternative, flies landing freely on your baby, seems far more unpleasant. Historians still argue whether insect-borne diseases significantly contributed to infant mortality in 19th-century America, or whether insects were merely a nuisance that added to summer misery, without dramatically affecting survival odds. The evidence is complicated. Malaria certainly killed infants in endemic areas, particularly in the southern states and along major waterways. Typhoid and dysentery, sometimes transmitted by flies, claimed many more. But isolating the insect contribution from the broader pattern of contaminated water and food proves difficult. Insects probably mattered, but how much remains uncertain. The battle against insects extends to bedtime rituals. Before placing your baby in the cradle for the night, you inspect the netting carefully, checking for holes and ensuring the edges are tucked securely under the mattress. You scan the enclosed space for any insects that might have slipped through, squashing the occasional mosquito that reveals itself too late. You listen for the telltale whine of mosquito flight, which might indicate a breach somewhere in your defences. The process takes minutes each evening, adding to the lengthy bedtime routine that summer demands. Some families burn substances believed to repel insects: dried herbs, sulphur, tobacco, creating smoke that drives mosquitoes and flies away, but also fills the room with potentially harmful fumes. You've tried this approach on the worst nights, burning a small pile of dried rosemary and lavender in a dish near the window, and the smoke does seem to reduce insect activity. But you worry about your baby breathing the smoke all night, and you've largely abandoned the practice except for emergencies. A quirky detail: some 19th-century mothers apply various substances directly to their baby's skin as insect repellents. Pennyroyal oil, derived from a mint family plant, has a long history of use against mosquitoes and fleas. Citronella from lemongrass is gaining popularity. Even kerosene, diluted, appears in some folk remedies. These applications are of uncertain effectiveness and potentially dangerous. Pennyroyal, in particular, is toxic in significant doses, but desperate mothers try them anyway, preferring the known risk of the remedy to the unknown risk of the insects. Your baby's skin shows the marks of the battle: small welts from mosquito bites that got through your defences, red irritations where flies landed and were scratched, a rash that might be insect-related or might be heat-related or might be something else entirely. In this era, skin conditions all blend together into undifferentiated misery. You apply what soothing agents you have and hope the skin heals before infection sets in. The afternoon brings a brief respite from flying insects, replaced by the different challenge of crawling ones. Ants, attracted by spilled milk and dropped food, have established trails through your kitchen. Bedbugs, which infest many 19th-century households regardless of cleanliness, emerge from mattress seams to feed at night. Fleas, carried by dogs and cats and rats, hop onto human hosts opportunistically. The insect world surrounds you, mostly invisible, occasionally making its presence felt through bites and itches, and the creeping sensation that something is crawling somewhere it shouldn't be. Evening returns, and with it the mosquitoes. You drape the netting, adjust the tucking, check for gaps, and hope your defences hold until morning. Outside your window, the insects swarm in the fading light, waiting for darkness to bring opportunities. Your baby sleeps, protected, you hope, by the thin barrier of mesh that separates safety from assault. The tooth hasn't even erupted yet, just a hard white ridge beneath swollen gums, but already you've attributed half your baby's symptoms to it. The fussiness that started 3 days ago, teething, the slight fever that came and went yesterday, teething, the diarrhea that has you watching the diaper contents with anxious attention, teething probably, though cholera infantum lurks in the back of your mind as an alternative explanation you don't want to consider. The belief that teething causes serious illness and even death runs deep in 19th-century American culture. Medical authorities affirm it, grandmothers and neighbours affirm it. The timing seems to confirm it, as babies often sicken during the months when teeth are emerging. The logic appears straightforward. The process of teeth cutting through gum tissue must produce inflammation, and inflammation causes fever, and fever can be dangerous. Add the observation that teething peaks during the summer months. Babies typically begin teething around 6 months, right when summer heat is most intense, and the correlation seems undeniable. The truth, which you have no way of knowing, is more complicated. Teething produces minor discomfort and possibly a slight temperature elevation, but nothing approaching the serious fevers and diarrheal diseases attributed to it. What actually kills babies in summer, contaminated milk, contaminated water, infectious diseases, happens to coincide with teething simply because both occur during the same developmental period. The correlation is real, the causation is imagined. But without the tools to distinguish correlation from causation, your era assumes that teething itself is a dangerous process requiring medical intervention. This misattribution has lethal consequences. Doctors prescribe aggressive treatments for teething disease that would be inappropriate or dangerous for any condition. Lancing the gums to release the teeth early becomes common practice, introducing infection risk in an era before antiseptic surgery. Teething powders, marketed as soothing remedies, often contain mercury, lead, or other toxic substances that accumulate in infant systems. The well-intentioned effort to help babies through the teething process instead subjects them to harmful interventions that increase rather than decrease mortality. Your doctor recommended gum lancing at your last visit, and you've been debating whether to proceed. The procedure involves using a small blade, or sometimes a sharp thumbnail, to slice through the gum tissue and release the emerging tooth. The rationale is that teeth trapped beneath swollen gums cause the dangerous symptoms, and freeing them provides relief. The reality is that the wounds often become infected in an environment where no one washes their hands properly, and instruments aren't sterilised. Babies have died from gum lancing infections, though such deaths get attributed to teething itself rather than to the treatment. You decide, guided by instinct rather than evidence, to avoid the lancing and let the teeth emerge naturally. The decision feels radical. You're rejecting professional medical advice, but something about the procedure has always troubled you. Perhaps it's the crying that other mothers describe, the bleeding, the swelling that seems to follow rather than precede the cutting. Perhaps it's simply maternal reluctance to subject your baby to pain when the necessity isn't obvious. Whatever the reason, you trust your own judgment and hope you're not making a fatal mistake. Historians still argue about the mortality impact of teething-related medical interventions in this era. The evidence strongly suggests that lancing and toxic teething powders killed significant numbers of babies who would otherwise have survived. But quantifying the damage is difficult because teething deaths get recorded as teething deaths, not as treatment deaths. The medical profession will eventually abandon these practices as germ theory and toxicology advance, but that abandonment lies decades in the future. For now, desperate mothers subject their babies to dangerous treatments in the sincere belief that they're helping. The teething powders deserve particular attention as a case study in well-intentioned harm. Products like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup and Cop's Baby's Friend contain morphine, which does indeed quiet fussy babies, permanently in some cases when overdoses stop breathing. Other powders contain calomel, that mercury compound that appears throughout 19th century medicine as a supposed cure-all that's actually a poison. The marketing for these products is sophisticated, featuring testimonials from satisfied mothers, and endorsements from physicians who should know better. You've been tempted to try them during particularly difficult nights when your baby won't stop crying and you're so exhausted that you can barely function. You resist the temptation, again following instinct. Something about the way those soothed babies look, limp, glassy-eyed, abnormally quiet, troubles you. Your baby's crying is exhausting, but it's also alive, active, a sign of functioning lungs and a functioning brain. The medicated quiet feels different, somehow wrong, and you'd rather endure the noise than the silence it produces. A quirky detail about teething mythology. Some families practice sympathetic magic, hanging various objects around the baby's neck in the belief that they will ease tooth eruption. A wolf's tooth, a piece of coral, a particular root or herb tied in a sachet. These amulets are supposed to draw the teething pain into themselves, sparing the baby. The practice has ancient roots and persists alongside more scientific medical interventions, representing a parallel tradition of infant care that learned men dismiss as superstition, but that provides comfort to mothers who feel they must do something. Your baby gnaws on a wooden ring you've provided, gums working against the smooth surface in what appears to be satisfying pressure. The teething process will continue for months, producing perhaps a dozen teeth by the first birthday, each one supposedly carrying risk of fever and disease. You'll worry about each tooth, watch for symptoms that might indicate teething trouble, or might indicate something else entirely, and navigate the contradictory advice that surrounds this natural developmental process. The tooth finally emerges a week later, a small white point visible through the pink gum tissue. Your baby seems no worse for the experience, a bit fussy perhaps, but fundamentally healthy. You feel vindicated in your decision to avoid intervention, though you'll never know whether the outcome would have been different with lancing or powders. The uncertainty is maddening, but it's the fundamental uncertainty of parenting in any era. You make choices based on incomplete information and hope for the best. The amber bottle sits on the pharmacy shelf, promising relief in elegant script. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for children teething, perfectly harmless. You've been eyeing it for weeks, wondering whether this might be the answer to the sleepless nights, the endless crying, the exhaustion that has reduced you to a hollow-eyed version of yourself. The other mothers in your neighbourhood swear by it. A few drops, and the fussiest baby becomes peaceful, sleepy, manageable. The price is reasonable. The label says, perfectly harmless. Why are you hesitating? The patent medicine industry in 19th-century America operates essentially without regulation. Anyone with a mixing bowl and a marketing budget can create a medicine, bottle it, and sell it to a desperate public. The ingredients don't have to be listed, the claims don't have to be proven, and the deaths that result from misuse rarely get traced back to the products that caused them. In this environment, medicines aimed at infants proliferate like weeds, each one promising to solve the problems that plague every parent: colic, teething pain, sleeplessness, general fussiness. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup is the market leader, but it has plenty of competition. Godfrey's cordial, Dalby's carminative, Cop's baby's friend, Jane's carminative balsam. The names blur together, but the active ingredients are remarkably consistent. Opium or morphine for sedation, alcohol for additional sedative effect, sugar for palatability, perhaps some herbal extracts for flavour or to support marketing claims about natural ingredients. The variation is in dosage and marketing rather than fundamental chemistry. The morphine content of these syrups varies wildly, both between products and between batches of the same product. A dose that produces pleasant drowsiness in one baby might produce fatal respiratory depression in another. The margin between therapeutic and lethal is narrow with opiates, particularly in infant systems that lack the developed metabolic pathways needed to process these substances. Parents who carefully measure the recommended dose may still be administering quantities that stop breathing during sleep. You've heard whispers about babies who died mysteriously after receiving soothing syrup, though the connection is never made explicitly. Mrs. Hennessy's sister's baby, who went to sleep so peacefully and never woke up. The infant at the foundling home, where syrups are used liberally to quiet entire wards of crying children, who was found cold in the morning. These deaths get attributed to various causes: teething, summer complaint, SIDS in retrospect. But a pattern lurks beneath the surface that would be obvious if anyone were looking for it. Historians have reconstructed this pattern, estimating that patent medicines killed thousands of American infants annually during the peak years of the unregulated market. The deaths were spread across the country, each one apparently isolated, with no one connecting the dots between the amber bottles and the small coffins. The medical profession bears some responsibility. Many doctors endorsed these products, accepted payments for testimonials, or simply failed to investigate deaths that occurred under their care. The regulatory failure was total, allowing profitable murder to masquerade as pediatric care. You stand in the pharmacy, bottle in hand, still hesitating. Something feels wrong about this product, this promise of easy peace. Your baby's crying is maddening, yes, but it's also natural, the sound of a healthy infant communicating needs. The silence that soothing syrup produces feels different, too quiet, too complete, too much like the silence of the grave. You put the bottle back on the shelf and walk out of the store, empty-handed but with your instincts intact. The decision will cost you more sleepless nights, more exhausted days, more moments when you want to scream with frustration at a baby who won't stop crying. But it might also save your baby's life, preserving a future that the amber bottle would have stolen. You'll never know for certain because you'll never take the alternative path, and this uncertainty, the fundamental uncertainty of every parenting choice, is what makes the decision so agonizing. Other mothers in your neighborhood don't share your instinctive caution. They use the soothing syrup regularly, praising its effectiveness, passing bottles back and forth when one mother runs out before her next trip to the pharmacy. Most of their babies survive, developing tolerance to the opiates and suffering only the subtle, developmental effects that will never be traced to early drug exposure. But some of their babies don't survive, and those deaths get attributed to the many other dangers that summer presents. A quirky detail about the marketing of these products: advertisers specifically target mothers' anxiety and exhaustion, implying that using soothing syrup makes you a better mother because it produces a calmer, happier baby. The marketing materials feature images of serene nurseries, peaceful infants, well-rested mothers enjoying domestic tranquility. The message is clear: if you love your baby, you'll give them this medicine. The manipulation is sophisticated enough to anticipate objections and counter them in advance. Perfectly harmless, the label assures, addressing the worry that might otherwise prevent purchase. The regulatory landscape will eventually change. Muckraking journalists will expose the contents of patent medicines. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 will require ingredient labelling. The soothing syrups won't disappear immediately. Morphine remains available longer than modern audiences might expect. But the era of completely unregulated infant drugging will gradually end. These reforms will come too late for the thousands of babies already dead, but they'll save future generations from the amber bottles that claimed so many 19th-century lives. Your baby continues to cry, and you continue to endure it. The sound grates on nerves already frayed by sleep deprivation and summer stress. You rock, you sing, you walk, you offer the breast, you do everything except medicate. The night stretches on, seemingly endless, and you wonder whether your caution is wisdom or foolishness. Dawn arrives, and your baby sleeps naturally, without pharmaceutical assistance. You're exhausted but alive, and your baby is alive, and the amber bottle remains on the pharmacy shelf where you left it, waiting for the next desperate mother who will make a different choice. The knock on your door comes from a woman you don't recognize, dressed in the practical clothing of a social reformer, rather than the fashionable attire of a society lady. She introduces herself as a representative of the Children's Aid Society, and she's here to tell you about a program that might save your baby's life. Fresh air excursions to the countryside, where city infants can escape the deadly summer heat. The fresh air movement is gaining momentum in urban centres throughout the northeast, driven by reformers who have observed the stark difference in infant mortality between crowded tenements and open farmland. Their solution is simple in concept, complex in execution: remove babies from dangerous urban environments and place them temporarily in healthful country settings. Fresh air, clean water, wholesome milk, space to breathe. These elements the reformers believe will reduce the summer death toll that shocks the conscience of any civilized society. The woman explains the logistics. You would bring your baby to a designated assembly point, where children are gathered for transport to participating farms upstate. The journey takes several hours by wagon or rail, travelling through increasingly rural landscape until the city becomes a distant memory. At the destination, families volunteer to house city children for periods ranging from a few days to several weeks. The service is free, funded by charitable donations and operated by volunteers, requiring nothing from you except willingness to let your baby go temporarily. The offer is tempting but terrifying. The urban environment has nearly killed your baby already. Escaping it, even briefly, seems logical. But the alternative, handing your infant to strangers for transport to an unknown destination, violates every protective instinct you've developed. How can you be sure the host families are responsible? How can you know your baby will receive proper feeding and care? What if something goes wrong during the journey or the stay, and you're too far away to help? The questions multiply faster than the reformer can answer them. You notice she's directing her pitch primarily at mothers in your neighbourhood's poorer streets, at the immigrant families and the struggling working class. The wealthy don't need charitable intervention. They can afford their own summer retreats. The fresh air movement, whatever its intentions, operates along class lines that make you uncomfortable. You're being offered charity, and while you need help, the power dynamic implicit in the offer grates against your pride. Historians have documented both the successes and failures of the fresh air movement. Thousands of children did benefit from summer country stays, experiencing health improvements that were visible and measurable. Infant mortality rates in participating families appear to have dropped, though the data is messy and confounded by other variables. But the movement also had a darker side. Some children were placed with families who exploited their labour, some were neglected or abused, some died in country settings that proved no safer than the cities they'd left. The reforms that eventually regulated child placement services emerged partly from fresh air movement scandals. You decline the woman's offer, politely but firmly. The decision feels right even as you worry it might be wrong. Your baby will stay in the city, under your supervision, facing whatever risks summer presents. You'll rely on your own resources, ice, clean water, careful feeding, endless vigilance, rather than surrendering your child to a system you can't control. The reformer accepts your refusal graciously, leaves her card in case you change your mind, and moves on to the next door. The fresh air movement will grow more systematic and professional in coming decades. The Children's Aid Society and similar organisations will develop screening procedures for host families, establish regular supervision protocols, and create the infrastructure for large-scale child relocation that will eventually include orphan trains heading west. The movement's mixed legacy, genuine help combined with insufficient oversight, mirrors the broader pattern of 19th-century child welfare efforts, where good intentions outpaced good implementation, a quirky innovation that emerges from fresh air philosophy, rooftop sleeping programs in urban areas. If children can't go to the country, reformers reason, at least they can access fresher air by sleeping on building rooftops, where breezes blow and distance from street-level miasmas reduces disease risk. Some tenement buildings install rooftop sleeping platforms specifically for this purpose, and families rotate through scheduled overnight sessions. The practice seems bizarre from a modern perspective, babies sleeping in the open air atop multi-storey buildings, but represents a genuine effort to apply fresh air principles within urban constraints. Your own building has no rooftop access, and you wouldn't use it if it did. Heights frighten you, and the thought of your baby sleeping 5 stories above the street produces nightmares rather than relief. But you understand the logic even if you don't embrace the practice. The summer air at street level feels thick, heavy, almost solid in its stillness. Elevation might actually help, might provide the circulation that ground level rooms lack. The woman's visit leaves you reflective. You've been offered an escape route and refused it, choosing the devil you know over the angel you don't. The choice might be wise or might be foolish. You won't know until September arrives and you count your survivors. Other mothers in your neighbourhood accept the fresh air offer, send their babies away, wait anxiously for reports from the country. Some of those babies return healthier than they left. Some return weakened by illness contracted en route. A few don't return at all. Summer continues, indifferent to your choices and anxieties. The heat rises, the flies buzz. The milk threatens contamination, and you navigate each day with the tools available. Fresh air might have helped. Fresh air might have introduced new risks. The counterfactual will never resolve itself, and you're left with the reality you've chosen. Your baby, your home, your summer, your survival. The reformer's card sits on your table, a reminder of alternatives not taken. Maybe next summer, if there is a next summer, you'll make a different choice. For now, you tend your baby and hope for the best. The woman next door speaks a language you don't fully understand, her German accent thick enough to obscure meaning even when she tries to communicate in English. But you've been watching her with her baby, noticing practices that differ from your own in ways both puzzling and intriguing. Yesterday she wrapped her infant in something that looked like moist cabbage leaves. Today she's feeding the baby a gruel made from rye flour that you've never seen any American mother use. Her baby seems to be thriving, and you wonder whether her old world wisdom contains knowledge that your new world methods lack. Immigration is transforming American cities in the mid-19th century, bringing millions of Europeans who carry their cultural practices across the Atlantic like invisible luggage. Irish, German, Italian, Jewish, Scandinavian. Each group arrives with traditions around infant care that developed over centuries in their homelands. Some traditions are helpful, some are harmful, most are simply different. The melting pot of American urban life produces a fascinating collision of approaches as immigrant mothers and native-born mothers observe each other, judge each other, and occasionally learn from each other. The German tradition of infant care emphasizes cleanliness, regular bathing, and systematic feeding schedules in ways that anticipate later American pediatric advice. German mothers tend to be meticulous about hygiene, possibly because German medical education has advanced further than its American counterpart. They're more likely to boil water and milk, more likely to maintain strict schedules, more likely to trust scientific authority over folk tradition. Some historians argue that German immigrant babies survived at slightly higher rates than babies from other ethnic groups, though the evidence is complicated by other factors like residential patterns and economic status. Irish immigrant mothers bring different traditions shaped by rural poverty and Catholicism. Large families are expected, and infant death is accepted, perhaps too accepted, as God's will. Breastfeeding tends to be prolonged, partly because artificial feeding is expensive and partly because extended nursing was the norm in Irish villages. Irish mothers cluster in the worst tenements, facing the highest environmental risks, and their babies die at rates that shock reformers who sometimes blame Irish cultural practices when they should be blaming Irish poverty. Italian and Eastern European Jewish immigrants bring yet other traditions. Mediterranean cultures emphasize olive oil in infant care, used for massage, for skin protection, for various therapeutic applications. Jewish tradition includes specific practices around infant feeding and hygiene that derive from religious law. Both groups tend to maintain strong family networks that provide support and advice to new mothers, potentially compensating for their unfamiliarity with American conditions. You've absorbed information from all these sources, creating your own syncretic approach to infant care. The German insistence on cleanliness has reinforced your own instincts. The Irish acceptance of fate has made you more philosophical about risks you can't control. The Italian use of oils has given you new ideas for treating diaper rash. The Jewish grandmother down the hall taught you a swaddling technique that seems to calm your baby better than anything you'd tried before. Your methods are no longer purely American, if they ever were. They're a collage assembled from the multicultural laboratory of your neighbourhood. Historians still argue about whether immigrant cultural practices significantly affected infant mortality rates, or whether economic and environmental factors overwhelmed any cultural differences. The evidence suggests that culture mattered at the margins but couldn't overcome the fundamental challenges of poverty, overcrowding, and contaminated food and water. A German mother's meticulous hygiene helped less when she lived in a tenement with no running water. An Irish mother's prolonged breastfeeding helped enormously, but couldn't continue if she had to return to work to feed her older children. The conflicts between cultural groups sometimes turn ugly. Native-born Americans blame immigrant ignorance for high infant mortality, ignoring the structural factors that concentrate death in immigrant communities. Immigrants blame each other, each group convinced that its own practices are superior, and that other groups' babies die because of cultural inferiority. Public health officials adopt the prejudices of their class, designing interventions that often miss the mark because they misunderstand the populations they're trying to help. A quirky detail: some immigrant groups maintain beliefs about infant care that strike American observers as bizarre. Italian mothers might tie red ribbons around their babies' wrists to ward off the evil eye. Irish mothers might attach saints' medals to infant clothing for spiritual protection. Jewish mothers might hang amulets with Hebrew prayers near the cradle. These practices have no medical value, but they provide psychological comfort to anxious mothers who feel surrounded by dangers they can't see or control. Your neighbour, the German woman with the cabbage leaves, finally explains her practice when you work up the courage to ask. Cabbage, she says, draws out heat and reduces inflammation. a traditional remedy for fevers that her grandmother used and her mother used and now she uses. She doesn't know the mechanism, only the tradition. You're skeptical but intrigued, and when your baby develops a mild fever next week, you find yourself wondering whether cabbage might help. The exchange of knowledge flows both ways. You teach the German woman about American patent medicines, warning her away from the soothing syrups that her unfamiliarity with the local market might otherwise lead her toward. She teaches you about the German practice of infant massage, demonstrating techniques that seem to calm her baby in ways that simple rocking doesn't achieve. Neither of you fully understands the other's culture, but both of you recognize that shared concern for your babies creates common ground that transcends language barriers. Summer continues, and the immigrant babies and the native-born babies face the same heat, the same contaminated milk, the same desperate mothers trying to keep them alive. The particular practices vary by household and by heritage, but the fundamental struggle is universal. Your baby might survive or might not. Her baby might survive or might not. Survival depends on factors that neither culture nor dedication can entirely control. The conversation lowers to a whisper when certain topics arise, certain families, certain histories that polite society prefers to ignore. You live in a northern state, but slavery's shadow stretches far beyond the Mason-Dixon line, and the summer survival of black infants, both enslaved and free, reveals aspects of American life that your white neighbors rarely discuss openly. In the South, enslaved mothers face conditions that compound every summer danger you experience. They have no control over their living conditions, their nutrition, their work schedules, or their baby's care. An enslaved woman might be forced to return to field labor days after giving birth, leaving her infant in the care of whoever the slaveholder designates. Perhaps an elderly enslaved woman too old for field work, perhaps an older child, perhaps no one in particular during the hours when everyone is working. The milk that might save the baby often flows instead into the mouths of the slaveholder's white children, as enslaved women are commonly forced to serve as wet nurses while their own babies go hungry. The mortality rates for enslaved infants are catastrophic, even by the brutal standards of the era. Some estimates suggest that half of all enslaved babies died before age 5, with summer contributing disproportionately to this toll. The reasons are obvious and overlapping. Inadequate nutrition for pregnant and nursing mothers, exposure to extreme heat during mandated labour, housing that provides minimal protection from temperature extremes, contaminated water sources, and complete absence of medical care beyond what the enslaved community could provide for itself. Yet within this horror, enslaved mothers developed survival strategies that deserve recognition. Traditional African practices around infant care were adapted to American conditions, creating syncretic approaches that sometimes proved more effective than the scientific medicine practiced on white babies. Extended breastfeeding, difficult to maintain under slavery's demands but fiercely protected when possible, provided advantages that bottle-fed babies lacked. Herbal remedies derived from both African and Native American knowledge offered alternatives to the toxic patent medicines that white mothers purchased at pharmacies. Free black families in the North face different but related challenges. Your city has a small but established black community, concentrated in neighborhoods that were already overcrowded before they arrived. These families face all the urban dangers you face: contaminated milk, bad water, stifling heat, plus the additional burden of racial discrimination that limits their housing options, employment opportunities, and access to medical care. A black mother trying to hire a doctor for her sick baby might find that white physicians refuse to treat black patients or charge premium prices for inferior care. The black mothers in your neighborhood have developed their own networks of support and information, parallel to but separate from the networks that serve white families. They share advice about safe milk sources, about doctors who will treat their children fairly, about cooling strategies that work in the cramped quarters they're forced to occupy. These networks are invisible to you unless you make deliberate effort to see them, and most white families don't make that effort. Historians have documented the racial disparities in infant mortality that characterized 19th century America, and persist, in modified form, to the present day. Black infants died at rates roughly double those of white infants throughout this period, a gap that reflects cumulative disadvantage rather than biological difference. The same environmental factors that threatened all babies, heat, contamination, disease, fell more heavily on black families because of where they were forced to live, what jobs they were forced to take, and what resources they were denied. a particularly grim aspect of southern slavery. Some slaveholders viewed infant mortality as an economic problem to be managed, rather than a human tragedy to be prevented. A surviving enslaved child represented future labour value, a dead one represented lost investment. This calculus sometimes produced better material conditions for enslaved infants, better housing, better food, time off from labour for pregnant women, but always within a framework that treated human beings as property. Any care provided was designed to maximise the slaveholder's return, not to respect the humanity of the enslaved. The northern states where you live have abolished slavery, but they haven't abolished racial hierarchy. Free black families theoretically have access to the same resources as white families, but practically face barriers that limit their options at every turn. The pattern will persist through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, through the long Jim Crow era, maintaining the racial gap in infant survival that began under slavery and continues through mechanisms that appear neutral but produce discriminatory outcomes. You observe the black families in your neighbourhood from a distance, recognising that their struggle parallels your own, but not fully grasping the additional weight they carry. Your summers are brutal, theirs are more brutal still. Your choices are constrained, theirs are more constrained. Your babies are vulnerable, theirs are more vulnerable. The common ground of motherhood connects you across the racial divide, but the divide remains, enforced by custom, law, and the accumulated injustice of generations. A quirky detail. Some black mothers practice infant care techniques that derive from West African traditions, passed down through generations of forced labour and maintained as cultural resistance against enslavement. These practices include specific ways of carrying babies, often on the back rather than the front, specific herbal remedies unknown to European traditions, and specific songs and sounds believed to soothe infants through rhythms that trace back across the Atlantic. The knowledge is precious, endangered, protected fiercely by the women who carry it. Summer doesn't distinguish between races when it comes to heat and contamination, but American society ensures that black families face these universal dangers from a position of greater vulnerability. The babies who die in the black neighbourhoods of your city die of the same causes as the babies who die in white neighbourhoods: cholera infantum, contaminated milk, heat stroke, but they die at higher rates because everything else about their circumstances is worse. Your baby sleeps, unaware of these larger patterns, focused only on immediate needs and comforts. The privilege you carry without knowing it shapes your infant's survival odds in ways you'll never fully understand. The letter from your sister in California describes a landscape so different from your eastern world that it might as well be another planet. The heat here is dry, she writes, like standing too close to an oven but without the dampness that makes your summers unbearable. The baby seems to tolerate it well, though we must constantly guard against dehydration. She's joined the Western migration, following her husband's mining ambitions, and now she raises her children in conditions that you can barely imagine. The American West presents summer challenges both similar to and profoundly different from those you face in established eastern cities. The heat can be more extreme. Desert temperatures routinely exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, but the lower humidity means that evaporative cooling actually works. Bodies can sweat effectively, and the suffocating oppression of humid eastern heat is absent. Western mothers trade one set of dangers for another, navigating an unfamiliar environment where traditional survival strategies may not apply. Pioneer families on the Great Plains have developed adaptations specific to their grassland environment. Dugout houses, carved into hillsides, provide natural temperature regulation far superior to frame buildings staying cool in summer and warm in winter. Sod houses with their thick earth walls similarly buffer against temperature extremes. These primitive dwellings lack the aesthetic appeal of Eastern architecture, but excel at keeping babies alive through temperature conditions that would defeat a conventional wooden house. The Native American peoples of the West possess millennia of knowledge about infant care in extreme climates, knowledge that some Western settlers have the wisdom to learn from. Indigenous mothers carry their babies in cradle boards that allow for airflow while protecting from sun exposure. They know which plants provide safe hydration, which practices help regulate infant temperature, which signs indicate dangerous heat stress. The cultural exchange between settlers and indigenous peoples is fraught with violence and exploitation, but in some cases it also includes the transfer of survival knowledge that benefits babies on both sides. Your sister describes practices that sound foreign to your Eastern experience. She bathes the baby multiple times daily, not for cleanliness, but for cooling. The evaporation providing relief that lasts until the skin dries again. She rests during the midday hours when temperatures peak, adopting the siesta pattern that Spanish colonizers brought from Mediterranean traditions. She has learned to read the baby's signs of dehydration, sunken fontanelle, dry mouth, scanty urine, with particular attention, because the dry heat can desiccate an infant faster than humid heat can overheat one. Historians still argue whether infant mortality rates on the western frontier exceeded or fell below those in established eastern cities. The evidence is complicated by limited record-keeping, selective migration, healthier families may have been more likely to undertake the journey, and the enormous variation in conditions across the diverse western landscape. A mining camp with contaminated water and inadequate food supply might be more deadly than any eastern tenement. A successful farm family in Oregon might enjoy conditions healthier than any eastern location. The journey west itself posed enormous risks to infants. Covered wagon travel meant weeks or months of exposure to weather extremes, limited food and water, unsanitary conditions, and isolation from any medical help. Babies who made it across the Great Plains or around Cape Horn were survivors of a brutal selection process. Those who didn't make it were buried in unmarked graves along trails that would eventually carry thousands more families toward their uncertain destinies. A quirky detail about Western infant care. Some pioneer families discovered that certain desert plants could be used to create infant medicines unknown to Eastern pharmacology. Aloe vera, which grows wild in southwestern regions, provided soothing gel for skin irritations. Various cacti produced juices that could be diluted for hydration when water sources were questionable. Indigenous peoples shared some of this knowledge, usually with individual families rather than with the settler population generally, creating pockets of botanical expertise scattered across the frontier. Your sister's baby survives the California summer, and her next letter brings photographs that show a healthy, alert child entirely adapted to Western conditions. The baby has never known Eastern humidity, never experienced the suffocating stillness of a Pennsylvania July. California is home, and California's summer is simply summer. Challenging but manageable within the framework of practices developed for this specific environment. You read the letters and imagine an alternative life, one where you followed your sister westward instead of staying in familiar surroundings. Your baby might have died during the journey, weakened by the rigours of overland travel, or might have thrived in dry western heat that suits some constitutions better than others. The counterfactual will never resolve itself. You can only live the life you're actually living, in the place you're actually living it. The western frontier will gradually become less frontier, and more civilization as railways extend, cities grow, and the wild territories transform into something resembling the East. The adaptations that pioneer families developed will fade as Eastern patterns of housing, commerce, and medicine establish themselves. Eventually, California babies will face summer challenges, not so different from Pennsylvania babies. Air conditioning rather than climate will equalize the experience. But for now, the West remains a distinct world with distinct survival strategies. Your sister promises to visit next summer, bringing her Western-raised children to meet their Eastern cousins. You'll compare notes, exchange advice, marvel at how differently the same human problem, keeping babies alive through heat, has been solved in different environments. The conversation will reveal both common ground and unbridgeable difference. The universal challenge of motherhood refracted through particular circumstances. Summer continues in your world and you trust it continues in hers, each of you navigating the particular dangers your particular geography presents. The man who examines your baby calls himself a specialist in the diseases of children, a designation that would have seemed absurd a generation ago but now carries the weight of emerging medical authority. Pediatrics is being born as a distinct specialty, separating from general medicine and developing its own theories, treatments, and professional associations. Your baby's care is caught in the transition between old and new, between traditional practices and scientific innovation, between the family physician who knew everything about everything and the specialist who knows one thing deeply. The old way of infant care relied on mothers, grandmothers, midwives, and general practitioners who learned as they went, accumulating experience through trial and error rather than systematic study. These caregivers might be wise or foolish, skilled or incompetent, helpful or harmful, but they were generalists, treating babies as part of the broader continuum of human health. A doctor who delivered a baby might also treat the grandmother's arthritis and the father's work injury, maintaining a family practice that spanned generations and conditions. The new way emerging in your era treats pediatrics as a science with distinct principles. Children, the specialists argue, are not simply small adults but fundamentally different organisms requiring specialized knowledge. Their metabolism, their physiology, their diseases, their treatments, all require particular expertise that general practitioners lack. The argument has merit. Babies do differ from adults in important ways, and specialized knowledge can save lives that general ignorance would lose. But specialization brings problems alongside solutions. The pediatric specialists sometimes exhibit the overconfidence of true believers, certain that their scientific approach renders traditional practices obsolete. They dismiss maternal wisdom as superstition, even when mothers observe things that science hasn't yet measured. They prescribe aggressive interventions, the same calomel and opiates that other physicians use, with scientific justifications that sound impressive but produce the same harmful results. The white coat conveys authority that isn't always deserved. The examination room where the specialist sees your baby represents the new order taking shape. Clean surfaces, bright lighting, medical instruments arrayed in orderly rows, a desk where the specialist records notes in precise handwriting. The environment communicates competence, modernity, progress, all the values that the emerging medical profession wants to associate with itself. You feel both reassured and intimidated, certain that this man knows more than you do, but uncertain whether his knowledge will actually help your baby. Historians still argue about whether the professionalization of pediatric medicine improved or worsened infant survival rates during the transition period. The evidence is mixed. Specialized knowledge did produce some genuine advances, better understanding of infant nutrition, more accurate diagnosis of certain conditions, the beginning of preventive care approaches. But specialized arrogance also produced harm, as doctors displaced effective traditional practices with ineffective or dangerous scientific alternatives. The physical examination proceeds with ritualistic precision. The specialist palpates your baby's abdomen, listens to the heart with a stethoscope, a relatively new instrument, still gaining acceptance, examines the skin and mucous membranes for signs of disease. He asks questions about feeding, sleeping, bowel movements, urination, creating a medical history that he'll analyse for patterns. The process feels thorough and modern, a welcome change from the cursory examinations that general practitioners often provide. His diagnosis, when it comes, is both reassuring and frustrating. Your baby is essentially healthy, he concludes, with no signs of the serious summer diseases you've been dreading. The symptoms you've been worrying about, the occasional fussiness, the mild loose stools, the slight temperature variations, all fall within normal ranges. He recommends continuing your current practices with minor adjustments. Slightly more frequent feeding, slightly cooler bathing water, slightly different positioning during sleep. The advice is specific, confident, and impossible to evaluate objectively. A quirky feature of early pediatric practice. Specialists sometimes recommend treatments for conditions they've essentially invented. A baby who seems irritable gets diagnosed with nervous debility and prescribed sedatives. A baby who spits up frequently gets diagnosed with dyspepsia and prescribed digestive remedies. The specialist vocabulary expands to fill the space created by parental anxiety, offering names and treatments for experiences that might simply be normal infant behaviour. The medicalisation of childhood begins here, in examination rooms where ordinary babies become patients. The fee for this consultation is significant, more than you'd pay a general practitioner for a longer visit. The specialist's expertise commands premium prices, creating another dimension of class inequality in infant care. Wealthy families access specialised knowledge that poor families can't afford, adding medical advantage to the environmental advantages that wealth already provides. Your own family's circumstances make the consultation a stretch, a splurge justified by the hope that expert advice might improve your baby's odds. You leave the examination room with a mixture of relief and skepticism. Relief because the specialist found nothing seriously wrong, skepticism because you're not entirely sure whether nothing seriously wrong was the correct diagnosis, or simply an artifact of the limited diagnostic tools available. The specialist is doing his best with the knowledge available. You are doing your best with the resources available. Neither of you has access to the certainties that future generations will take for granted. Pediatric medicine will continue to evolve throughout your lifetime and beyond. The germ theory of disease will revolutionise understanding of what actually causes infant illness. Vaccination will prevent some of the deadliest childhood diseases. Improved nutrition and sanitation will reduce mortality far more effectively than any medical intervention. By the 20th century, infant death will transform from a statistical probability to a rare tragedy, and doctors will take credit for changes that reflect broader social progress, at least as much as medical innovation. For now, you continue navigating the uncertain terrain between tradition and science, between maternal instinct and professional authority. Your baby is alive, is healthy enough for a specialist to pronounce essentially normal. You'll take the victory and continue the fight. The knock at your door brings Mrs. Patterson, whose baby died last week and who needs to talk to someone who might understand. You welcome her in, put the kettle on for tea, and settle into the kind of conversation that connects mothers across circumstances. The sharing of fears, strategies, hopes and griefs that creates community resilience against the summer's assault. Maternal networks have operated since before recorded history, passing knowledge from woman to woman through conversations exactly like this one. No textbook captures what gets exchanged in these informal gatherings. No medical professional could replicate the combination of practical advice, emotional support, and shared experience that flows between mothers who face the same challenges. Mrs. Patterson knows things about cholera infantum that she learned watching her baby die. Hard knowledge, bought with grief, and she's passing it to you so that perhaps your baby won't teach you the same lessons. The network in your neighbourhood has its own unspoken structure. Experienced mothers who've raised multiple children to adulthood hold particular authority. Their survival strategies have been tested by repetition. New mothers seek out these veterans, asking questions that might seem naive but that contain the urgency of genuine need. Women who've recently lost babies occupy a painful middle position. They know too much about what can go wrong, but may also know something about what to do when things start going wrong. Information that arrived too late to save their own children, but might save someone else's. You've been both teacher and student in this network. Earlier this summer, you advised a first-time mother on cooling techniques, sharing the wet sheet method your neighbour taught you months ago. Last week, an experienced grandmother taught you a new approach to night feeding that seems to reduce colic. The knowledge flows in all directions, accumulating in the community like water in a reservoir, available to anyone who asks. Historians have recognised the importance of these maternal networks but struggle to document them systematically. The conversations happen in kitchens and parlours, in church fellowship halls and market squares, leaving no written records for researchers to analyse. What we know comes from memoirs, letters, and the occasional ethnographic observation. Fragments that suggest a vast invisible infrastructure of shared maternal knowledge supporting infant survival. The network extends beyond advice to practical mutual aid. When Mrs. Hennessy was bedridden with fever last month, other mothers took turns caring for her baby, passing the infant from house to house throughout the day so it could be fed and changed while she recovered. When the Schmidt family ran out of ice during the worst heat wave, neighbours pooled their diminishing supplies to share the protection as widely as possible. These informal arrangements aren't charity. They're survival strategies that recognise how interdependent families become when conditions threaten everyone's children. A particularly valuable network function involves watching for signs of trouble across multiple households. A mother who notices unusual listlessness in a neighbour's baby can raise the alarm, potentially catching illness early enough to make a difference. Mothers share observations about which milk vendors seem to produce healthier babies, which doctors seem to help rather than harm, which traditional remedies actually work. The collective intelligence of the network exceeds what any individual could accumulate alone. Mrs. Patterson's grief is raw, barely a week old, and she talks about her baby for longer than the tea takes to cool. The details are painfully familiar. The first signs of diarrhoea, the rapid progression, the interventions that failed to stop the decline, the final hours when nothing could be done but hold and pray. You listen because listening is what the network requires, because today she needs to tell the story, and tomorrow you might need to tell yours. You share what you can, your cooling strategies, your feeding approach, your wariness of patent medicines, knowing that nothing you say can bring back her baby, but hoping something might help if she has another child. She takes the information with the desperate attention of someone determined to do better next time, though better may not have been within her power this time. The randomness of infant survival is one of the hardest truths the network must carry. Sometimes parents do everything right, and babies die anyway. A quirky network practice involves tracking outcomes and comparing notes at summer's end. Mothers who've made it through another deadly season gather to assess what worked and what didn't, creating an informal epidemiological survey that identifies patterns the medical profession often misses. The year that 3 babies on your street all died after being fed from the same milk vendor led to collective action. Mothers pressuring the vendor to improve his practices or lose their business. The network has power when it acts together. The afternoon passes, and Mrs. Patterson leaves with the beginnings of comfort, or at least the beginnings of re-engagement with life. Her grief will fade eventually, or at least become manageable, and she'll likely try again. Another pregnancy, another baby, another summer to survive. The cycle continues, generation after generation, mothers connecting with mothers in the ongoing project of keeping children alive. You watch her walk down the street and wonder whether you would survive the loss she's surviving. The thought is unbearable, so you turn away from it, back to your own baby who is, for this moment, healthy and breathing and demanding your attention. The network will hold you if the worst happens, just as it's holding Mrs. Patterson now. You're not alone, even when you feel alone. The pamphlet that lands in your hands one October morning describes a theory so strange that it takes you 3 readings to grasp its implications. Diseases, the pamphlet claims, are caused not by miasmas or imbalances in bodily humours, but by tiny living organisms too small to see with the naked eye. These germs enter the body through contaminated food, water or air, multiply in the tissues, and produce the symptoms we recognise as illness. The theory is controversial. Many physicians reject it. But if it's true, everything you thought you knew about keeping your baby alive might need revision. Germ theory is emerging from the laboratories of European scientists, particularly Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany, and slowly penetrating American medical consciousness. The theory explains so much that miasma theory couldn't. Why some diseases spread from person to person while others don't. Why sanitation seems to reduce illness even when miasmas are still present. Why certain interventions like boiling water actually work. But the theory also faces resistance from practitioners invested in older paradigms and suspicious of foreign innovations. The implications for infant care are revolutionary. If cholera infantum is caused by germs rather than bad air or teething, then preventing it requires different strategies. Killing germs before they enter the baby's system, or preventing them from entering in the first place. The pamphlet recommends boiling milk to kill bacteria, a practice you've been doing inconsistently, but that now takes on new significance. It recommends careful hand washing before preparing infant food, an approach that makes intuitive sense but that most of your neighbours don't practice. It recommends keeping flies away from food, since flies can carry germs on their feet. You've been doing some of these things without understanding why they work. Your instinct that cleanliness matters, your wariness of milk that's sat out too long, your elaborate cooling systems that happen to reduce bacterial growth. All these practices align with germ theory, even though you adopted them for different reasons. The pamphlet validates your approach while giving it scientific foundation, and you feel a strange vindication reading that your mother wisdom anticipated professional conclusions. Pasteurization is the specific intervention that will transform infant survival once it's widely adopted. The process involves heating milk to a temperature that kills most bacteria without significantly altering taste or nutrition, then cooling it rapidly to prevent recontamination. Louis Pasteur developed the technique for the French wine industry, and it's gradually being applied to milk as the connection between bacterial contamination and infant mortality becomes clearer. Your city has a few dairies experimenting with pasteurization, selling sterilized milk at premium prices to families who can afford the extra cost. You can't afford pasteurized milk, but you can approximate the process at home. The pamphlet provides instructions. Heat milk to just below boiling, maintain that temperature for several minutes, then cool rapidly by immersing the container in cold water. The process is labour-intensive and fuel-consumptive, adding to your already overwhelming daily workload. But if it could reduce your baby's risk of cholera infantum, the effort would be worthwhile. Historians mark the late 19th century as the turning point when infant mortality began its long decline, a decline that would continue throughout the 20th century until childhood death became rare rather than expected. Multiple factors contributed: germ theory and pasteurization, improved water treatment and sanitation, better nutrition and housing conditions, and eventually vaccination against the deadliest childhood diseases. No single factor deserves full credit. The achievement was collective, emerging from science, public health, social reform, and individual practice. The city's public health authorities are beginning to act on these new insights. Milk inspection programs, however imperfect, try to identify and shut down the worst swill dairies. Water treatment facilities, in cities that have them, reduce bacterial contamination of the public supply. Education campaigns target mothers with advice about safe infant feeding, though the advice is sometimes contradictory, and the campaigns often patronising. The infrastructure of modern public health is being assembled piece by piece from the lessons learned through decades of infant death. A quirky detail about the transition period. Some physicians resist germ theory partly because it implies that their previous practices were wrong, possibly harmful. A doctor who spent decades prescribing calomel and bleeding as treatments for diarrheal disease now faces evidence that these interventions probably killed more patients than they saved. Professional pride makes such admissions difficult, and some physicians retreat into skepticism about the new theory rather than acknowledge their past errors. Your baby survived this summer, and the survival feels more meaningful now that you understand something about what you are fighting against. Not miasmas, but bacteria. Not bad air, but contaminated milk. Not divine punishment, but preventable disease. The reframing changes nothing about what actually happened, but it changes how you'll approach next summer, and the summer after that, and all the summers until your children are grown, and facing their own parenting challenges. The pamphlet gets tucked into the family Bible, between pages where you've also pressed flowers from your baby's baptism, and recorded vital statistics in your careful handwriting. It's a document of the transition, a marker of the moment when old knowledge began giving way to new. Your grandchildren, if you're lucky enough to have them, will live in a world where germ theory is simply obvious, where pasteurized milk is standard, where infant death is shocking rather than expected. You won't fully see that world, but you're helping build it, one careful practice at a time. September arrives like a benediction, the air finally cooling, the death statistics beginning their seasonal decline, the exhaustion of summer survival giving way to something resembling ordinary life. Your baby has made it through another deadly season, joining the cohort of survivors who will face next year's challenges from a position of greater strength. The achievement feels enormous, though you're too tired to celebrate properly. Looking back across the summer months, you can trace the path you've walked with something approaching wonder. The endless vigilance over milk and water, the cooling systems improvised from wet sheets and strategic airflow, the battles against insects and heat, against contaminated food and dangerous medicines, against your own exhaustion and the seductive promises of patent remedies, the network of mothers who supported you when you faltered, sharing knowledge and labour in the collective project of keeping babies alive. The statistics that will eventually be compiled show that infant mortality dropped slightly this year compared to last, part of a long-term trend that will accelerate as the century closes. Your baby is one data point in that improvement, a survivor counted in columns that future historians will analyse for patterns and correlations. But you don't think in statistics. You think in small hands reaching for your face, in midnight feedings when the house is finally quiet, in the ordinary miracle of a baby who woke up this morning when so many others didn't. The legacy of this summer extends beyond your individual household, into the broader project of improving infant survival. The practices you've developed, the knowledge you've accumulated, the instincts you've refined, all of these will flow into the maternal network, helping other mothers navigate their own summers. The pamphlet about germ theory will circulate among your neighbours, shifting practice gradually in directions that reduce mortality, even when the theory itself isn't fully understood. The pressure on milk vendors to improve their practices will continue, backed by the collective purchasing power of mothers who've learned to be suspicious. Historians studying 19th-century infant mortality often focus on the large-scale interventions, pasteurization, water treatment, public health regulations, that drove the dramatic improvements of the late 19th and 20th centuries. These interventions deserve the attention. They saved millions of lives. But the individual mothers who kept individual babies alive through individual summers also deserve recognition. The germ theory pamphlet would have meant nothing if mothers hadn't read it and applied it. The pasteurized milk would have meant nothing if mothers hadn't demanded it and purchased it. The public health regulations would have meant nothing if mothers hadn't supported them politically and complied with them personally. Your contribution to this history is invisible in the official record. No archive preserves your wet sheet cooling system or your careful milk boiling routine. No historian knows that you rejected patent medicines when other mothers embraced them, that you trusted your instincts when doctors gave contradictory advice, that you sat through long nights watching for signs of trouble that might signal the beginning of the end. Your summer is lost to history, except as one component of aggregate statistics that show things getting slightly better. But perhaps that invisibility is appropriate. The work of keeping babies alive was never meant to be heroic or documented. It was simply what mothers did, generation after generation, out of love and necessity and the desperate hope that this particular child would be the one who survived. You join a long lineage of such mothers, stretching back to the first human communities and forward to a future where your great-great-grandchildren will live in a world almost unimaginably safer than yours. The gratitude that should accompany this reflection is complicated by exhaustion and by the awareness that next summer will bring new challenges. You're not done. You're merely resting. The baby who survived this summer will face next summer as a toddler, more mobile and more capable of getting into trouble, less dependent on milk but more dependent on water and food that must somehow be kept safe. The fight continues, slightly different in form, fundamentally similar in substance. You hold your sleeping baby in the evening light of this first September day, feeling the weight of this small body, the warmth of this small life. Outside your window, the trees are just beginning to show the first hints of autumn colour, promising relief from the heat that has dominated your thoughts for months. The world is cooling, and your baby is alive, and these two facts together feel like more blessing than you deserve. The evening deepens now, the words growing softer, the story approaching its natural rest. You've travelled through a world where every summer day brought danger, where mothers became engineers and detectives and nurses, where community networks and personal intuition substituted for knowledge that hadn't yet been discovered. You've seen the contaminated milk, the impossible choices, the deadly treatments that well-meaning doctors prescribed, the slow accumulation of practices that eventually transformed infant survival from desperate hope to reasonable expectation. That world is distant now, separated from you by generations of progress and the enormous good fortune of modern medicine, clean water, safe food. The babies who died in those long-ago summers are forgotten, their names lost even when the gravestones remain, but they helped shape the world you inherited simply by dying. Their deaths motivated the reforms that protect you now. Sleep comes easily tonight, I hope, as the last echoes of this story fade into the quiet darkness. Your own breath rises and falls with the easy rhythm of someone who has never feared summer, never calculated survival odds, never held a baby and wondered if this small life would last the week. The mothers of the 19th century send their wishes across time. May you never face what they faced. May your children never face what their children faced. May the progress they paid for with grief and labour continue forward into a future where every baby survives every summer. Rest now. Let the